Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the golden sandals of an Egyptian pharaoh, and before you start dreaming of unlimited power and gleaming treasures, let me tell you something that might shatter that fantasy completely. You're standing in the pre-dawn darkness of your palace chamber, and already 3 priests are outside your door, chanting the morning hymns that will awaken you as the living incarnation of Horus. Your eyes aren't even fully open yet, but the ritual has begun. You don't get to stretch, yawn, or scratch that itch on your back. Every movement from this moment forward is prescribed, watched, and recorded. The story may solve mysteries you never had an explanation for, like why so many pharaohs died young, why their mummies show signs of stress-related diseases, and why being a god king was less about divine privilege and more about divine imprisonment. So, before you explore the story with me, please take a moment to help me subscribe to the channel, like and share this video, or maybe leave a comment below, but make sure you do it when you really like what I bring to you. Tell me where you're watching from tonight, or maybe share what you thought being a pharaoh was like before this video. I'd love to hear from you. Now, let's keep the lights as soft as possible, turn on the fan for a gentle sound to help the story feel more emotional, and let's embark on tonight's journey together. You open your eyes to the sound of sacred hymns, but you're not allowed to simply wake up like a normal person. The priests enter your bedchamber in a precise formation, 3 on the left, 3 on the right, and they begin the purification ritual that will consume the first hour of your morning. Your body isn't your own anymore. It belongs to Egypt, to the gods, to the cosmic order called Ma'at that you're supposed to embody. One priest carries a golden basin of water drawn from a sacred well. Another holds the incense burner that will cleanse the air around you. A third priest has already begun reciting the pyramid texts, those ancient spells that remind everyone in the room, especially you, that you're not just a king, but a living bridge between the mortal world and the divine realm. The water is cold when they pour it over your hands. You're not permitted to wash yourself. That would be beneath the dignity of a god. Instead, the priests perform ablutions on you while you stand there, naked and shivering slightly in the cool morning air that drifts through the palace windows. They're muttering prayers the entire time, and you're expected to respond at specific intervals with the correct liturgical phrases. Mess up the call and response, and the priests will exchange worried glances if the pharaoh can't even get the morning ritual right. What does that say about the cosmic order? What does it mean for Egypt's prosperity? Here's something historians love to debate. Did pharaohs actually believe they were gods? Or were they just exceptionally good actors trapped in an impossible role? Some scholars point to private letters and medical texts that suggest pharaohs saw themselves as human administrators with a divine job description. Others argue that from childhood, pharaohs were so thoroughly indoctrinated into their god status that they genuinely believed their own divinity. Either way, you're living it now, and the distinction doesn't matter much when 3 priests are dressing you in the sacred linen that only you're allowed to wear. The linen itself is another trap. It's woven so finely that it's practically transparent, a mainstream historical fact that often surprises people who picture pharaohs in thick, concealing robes. This near transparency is intentional. It demonstrates the purity and luxury of Egypt's textile production. But it also means you're basically walking around in expensive gauze, visible to everyone, perpetually on display. The priests wrap you in layer after layer of this delicate fabric, each wrap accompanied by another prayer, another invocation. Your arms must be positioned just right. Your stance must convey divine authority. Even your facial expression is scrutinized too stern and you seem tyrannical, too soft and you appear weak. Then comes the jewelry. The broad collar, the iconic piece you've seen in every museum, weighs about 3 pounds by itself. It's made of gold, carnelian, turquoise, and lapis lazuli, all meticulously arranged in rows that represent the cosmos. Beautiful, absolutely. Comfortable, Not even remotely. The collar sits on your shoulders and collarbone, and within an hour you'll feel the ache spreading across your upper back. But you can't adjust it. You can't ask for a break. You're a god, and gods don't fidget with their jewellery like commoners. The morning dressing ritual takes nearly 2 hours, and you haven't even had breakfast yet. Actually, that's not quite accurate. You can't eat breakfast until the priests have first offered food to the gods in the temple, received the divine blessing, and brought the sanctified food back to you. Your stomach growls, gods apparently do that, but you wait. You wait because that's what pharaohs do. They wait for priests, for rituals, for the endless machinery of religious ceremony to grant them permission to perform basic human functions. Here's a quirky detail that doesn't make it into most history books. Pharaohs had official sandal bearers whose entire job was to carry the royal footwear and decide when the pharaoh was permitted to go barefoot versus when sandals were required. Different ceremonies demanded different footwear states. Some rituals required bare feet to maintain ritual purity. Others demanded sandals to elevate the pharaoh above the profane ground. You'd think the god king of Egypt could decide for himself when to wear shoes, but no, even that choice belongs to someone else. The sun is rising now, painting the palace walls in shades of amber and gold. Through the window, you can see the Nile, that great serpent of life that makes Egypt possible. But you can't just walk to the window and gaze at the view like a normal person appreciating a beautiful morning. Every movement is observed, interpreted, and recorded. The priests are watching to see if you look east or west first. It matters symbolically. The servants are watching to see if you seem pleased or troubled. It affects palace morale. The guards are watching for any sign of weakness or illness. It could indicate that Mayat is disrupted. That cosmic order is breaking down. You finally get to eat, but even this isn't a private moment. Lesser nobles and officials are granted the honour of watching the pharaoh consume his morning meal. They stand at a respectful distance, observing as you eat bread, figs, and beer that have been blessed by priests. You're expected to eat with divine grace, which apparently means slowly and without visible enthusiasm. Gods don't shovel food into their mouths like hungry humans. You take small, measured bites while dozens of eyes track your every movement. Your day has barely begun, and already you're exhausted from performing yourself. The priests have finished with your morning rituals, and now you're being escorted to the throne room where your wife awaits the great royal wife. They call her, which sounds impressive until you remember that she's also your half-sister. Her name's Nefertari or Meritamun or perhaps Ankhesenamun, depending on which dynasty you're ruling in. But what never changes is the fact that her bloodline connects to yours in ways that make modern people deeply uncomfortable. You look at her across the room, and she offers you a formal smile that's been practiced since childhood. This is the woman you'll share your reign with, produce heirs with, and maintain the divine bloodline with all, while navigating the bizarre reality that family reunions and state functions are essentially the same event. The practice of royal sibling marriage wasn't just accepted in ancient Egypt, it was actually encouraged. Sometimes even required. Mainstream historical records show that this tradition stretched back thousands of years, rooted in mythology itself. The gods Osiris and Isis were siblings who married, and pharaohs were supposed to emulate the divine example. If it was good enough for the gods, the reasoning went, it was certainly appropriate for their earthly representatives. You're living inside that mythology now, and there's no escape from it. Your sister wife sits beside you on a slightly smaller throne. Symbolism matters here, and together you present the image of divine unity that Egypt requires. Here's what nobody tells you about royal marriages. They're essentially political contracts with a biological imperative attached. Your sister wife didn't choose you any more than you chose her. You are both assigned to each other by priests, advisors, and the inexorable demands of royal succession. The priest needed to ensure that the divine blood remained concentrated, undiluted by common lineage. Historians still argue whether ancient Egyptians understood the genetic risks of inbreeding, or if they simply attributed physical problems to other causes like curses or divine displeasure. Either way, you're expected to produce healthy heirs from this union, and if those heirs emerge with health problems, which they often did, it's considered a failure of your spiritual worthiness, not a consequence of genetics. Your sister wife is surrounded by her own retinue of servants and ladies-in-waiting, and she has her own political faction within the palace. Don't mistake the sibling bond for automatic alliance. Some of history's most vicious court intrigues involved royal siblings who were married to each other, competing for influence over their mutual children who would inherit the throne. She might love you, she might tolerate you, or she might be actively plotting to ensure that her son, not the son of a secondary wife, becomes the next Pharaoh. You can never be entirely certain which scenario you're living in. The priests enter again, this time to oversee the daily ritual where you and your wife make offerings to the royal ancestors. You stand together, holding ceremonial implements, while priests chant the names of dead pharaohs stretching back generations. Some of those names belong to your shared great-grandfathers and great-grandmothers who are also siblings married to each other. The family tree doesn't branch so much as loop back on itself repeatedly. If you try to draw it out, it would look less like a tree and more like a tangled knot of interconnected relationships that would give a genealogist a headache. Here's a quirky detail that rarely makes it into documentaries. Royal couples had separate bedchambers and often separate sections of the palace. The great royal wife maintained her own household, her own staff, and her own schedule. You didn't just casually wander into each other's rooms like a normal married couple. Every private meeting required coordination between your respective staffs. And even intimate moments were scheduled affairs that involved priests performing fertility blessings beforehand. Nothing spontaneous happened in the palace. Nothing private truly existed. Your wife is wearing the vulture crown today, that elaborate headdress featuring a golden vulture with outstretched wings that frames her face. It's both beautiful and vaguely threatening, which probably captures the essence of royal marriage perfectly. The vulture represents Nekhbet, the protective goddess of Upper Egypt, and your wife wears it to signal her role as the kingdom's mother. But vultures are also scavengers, and there's something darkly appropriate about that symbolism too. Royal marriages could be nurturing, but they could also be predatory, with each spouse trying to advance their own interests and their preferred children's claims to power. The succession question hangs over everything. You need a son, ideally multiple sons, because infant mortality rates are brutal even for royal children. But here's the trap: too many sons create instability. Each prince becomes a potential rival, a possible usurper, a threat that your advisors will constantly warn you about. Your wife knows this too. She's calculating which of her sons has the best chance of surviving both childhood diseases and palace politics. She's forming alliances with powerful nobles who might support her chosen heir. She's watching the secondary wives and their children with the vigilance of someone who understands that royal motherhood is a competitive sport with the highest possible stakes. Those secondary wives are another dimension of this nightmare. As Pharaoh, you're expected to maintain a substantial harem, partly for diplomatic reasons, partly to ensure multiple potential heirs, and partly because demonstrating virility was considered evidence of divine favour. Some of these women are daughters of foreign kings, sent to Egypt to seal treaties and alliances. Others are daughters of powerful Egyptian nobles who want a connection to the throne. A few might even be women you actually chose yourself, though that's rare. Each one represents a different political faction, a different set of obligations, and a different potential source of sons who might challenge your sister wife's preferred heir. Your sister wife handles this reality with practiced grace, at least in public. She knows she can't eliminate the other wives. They serve important political functions, but she can certainly make their lives uncomfortable and ensure that their sons face obstacles in the succession. Court politics become a multi-generational chess game, where the pieces are your children and the board is the entire Egyptian state. You're simultaneously the player and a piece in someone else's game. Historians love to point out examples of royal siblings who genuinely seem to care for each other, despite the arranged nature of their marriages. Letters and artwork suggest that some pharaohs and their sister wives developed real affection over years of shared rule. But there are just as many examples of royal marriages that were cold, strategic arrangements where the spouses barely spoke to each other outside of required ceremonies. You might get lucky and find genuine companionship with your sister wife, or you might spend decades performing affection while privately maintaining separate lives. The afternoon brings another ceremony, this time in the palace gardens, where you and your wife must appear together before foreign ambassadors. You walk side by side, maintaining the precise distance that protocol requires, close enough to show unity, far enough to preserve individual dignity. Your hands don't touch. You don't whisper to each other or share private jokes. You're performing royal marriage for an audience that will report everything they see back to distant kingdoms. The ambassadors bow deeply, and you can see them trying to understand the dynamics of your relationship through careful observation. Are you allies, rivals? Both. The truth is probably something you're still figuring out yourself. The ambassador from the Hittite kingdom has finally departed, and the servants are already preparing you for the afternoon's public procession through Thebes. This means it's time for the crown, the actual physical crown that's become the universal symbol of pharaonic power. You've been wearing various ceremonial headdresses all morning, but now comes the shent, the double crown that combines the white crown of Upper Egypt with the red crown of Lower Egypt into one towering statement of unified dominion. The priest approaches carrying it on a cushion, and you feel your neck muscles tense in anticipation because you know exactly what's coming. This thing weighs somewhere between 5 and 7 pounds depending on which crown is being used today, and all of that weight sits directly on top of your skull for the next 4 to 6 hours. The mainstream historical record confirms that Egyptian crowns were never found in archaeological excavations. Not a single physical example exists, which has led to fascinating debates about what they were actually made from. Most scholars believe they were constructed from leather, fabric, plant fibres, and metal elements, shaped into the iconic forms we see carved on every temple wall. But here's what the carvings don't show you: how the internal structure digs into your scalp, how sweat pools under the thick material in the Egyptian heat, or how the weight creates a constant, grinding pressure that radiates from the crown of your head down through your neck and into your shoulders. You're about to spend the afternoon experiencing all of that firsthand. The priest lifts the crown and carefully positions it on your head. Immediately, you feel the familiar compression, like someone's pressing down on your skull with steady, unrelenting force. The crown has an internal structure, some kind of framework that's supposed to distribute the weight. But it never quite works as intended. Within minutes, you'll feel the first twinges of a headache forming. Within an hour, that headache will bloom into a full throbbing sensation that pulses in time with your heartbeat. But you can't remove it. You can't even reach up to adjust it slightly when it shifts and starts digging into a particularly sensitive spot above your left temple. Gods don't fuss with their crowns like mortals fiddling with uncomfortable hats. The procession begins, and you're seated in an ornate carrying chair that's hoisted onto the shoulders of 12 strong men. You'd think being carried would be relaxing, but the chair sways and bounces with every step the bearers take, which means the crown is constantly shifting, constantly adjusting its pressure points against your skull. You grip the armrests and keep your head as still as possible, trying to minimize the movement. Your neck muscles are already starting to burn from the effort of keeping your head perfectly upright and balanced. Let your head tilt even slightly forward, and the crown's weight multiplies, dragging your whole head down. Tilt backward, and the crown might actually slip off, which would be a catastrophic loss of dignity in front of thousands of spectators. The Egyptian sun is merciless today. It's the kind of heat that makes the air shimmer and turns stone surfaces too hot to touch. You're wearing multiple layers of royal linen, that heavy collar across your shoulders, various bracelets and armbands, and now this crown that's essentially trapping heat against your skull like a personal oven. Sweat begins trickling down your forehead, and you can't wipe it away. A servant walking alongside your carrying chair occasionally fans you with a large ostrich feather fan, but it barely makes a difference. The sweat reaches your eyes, stinging, and you blink rapidly while maintaining that divine, impassive expression that pharaohs are supposed to project at all times. Here's a quirky medical detail that ancient Egyptian physicians definitely noticed, but probably didn't connect to crown-wearing many pharaohs' mummies show evidence of chronic neck problems, compressed vertebrae, and stress-related bone changes in the upper spine. Modern forensic analysis reveals that some pharaohs basically developed repetitive stress injuries in their necks from years of supporting heavy crowns. The divine regalia was literally crushing their cervical vertebrae over time. But no one could acknowledge this reality, because admitting that the crown hurt would be admitting that the pharaoh was subject to human physical limitations and gods, by definition, don't get neck pain from their holy symbols of office. The procession route takes you through the main avenue of Thebes, past the massive pylons of Karnak Temple, and through neighbourhoods where people have lined the streets to see their living god pass by. They're prostrating themselves, pressing their faces to the ground in reverence. You're supposed to gaze benevolently upon them, while the crown continues its relentless assault on your skull. Behind your eyes, the headache has evolved from a dull throb to sharp, ice-pick sensations that spike with every bounce of the carrying chair. You're starting to feel nauseous from the combination of heat, pain, and swaying motion, but you can't show it. Your face remains serene, slightly smiling, divinely detached from mortal discomfort. Historians still argue whether pharaohs ever passed out from heat exhaustion during these public processions, or if the records were sanitized to remove such embarrassing incidents. There are cryptic references in some temple inscriptions to pharaohs needing to rest in the sacred pavilion during ceremonies, which might be euphemistic language for the king nearly collapsing from heat stroke. You're understanding right now how that could happen. The combination of physical weight, psychological pressure, and environmental conditions creates a perfect storm of physical stress. Your vision is starting to blur slightly at the edges, whether from the pain, the heat, or the early stages of dehydration. You're not entirely sure. The procession finally reaches the temple where you're scheduled to perform offerings. The bearers lower your chair, and you stand carefully, because sudden movements make the crown shift dangerously. Your legs are stiff from sitting still for so long, and your neck feels like a column of fire. But you walk forward with measured, dignified steps. The crowd watches every movement, looking for signs and omens in how the pharaoh moves, how he carries himself, whether the gods seem pleased with him today. You climb the temple steps, each one sending a jarring impact through your body and directly into your aching head. Inside the temple, there's at least some shade and slightly cooler air, but the relief is minimal. The crown has been on your head for nearly 3 hours now, and you've got at least 2 more hours of ceremonies ahead. The priests are already beginning their chants, and you take your position before the altar. This is where you'll stand, mostly motionless, while endless prayers are recited and offerings are made. Standing still sounds easy until you're doing it with a 5-pound weight compressing your skull and neck muscles that are screaming for relief. You focus on your breathing, trying to use meditation techniques that your childhood tutors taught you for exactly these situations. Breathe in slowly, breathe out slowly. Try to separate your consciousness from the physical sensations of pain and exhaustion. The truth that no one acknowledges is that being Pharaoh is partly an endurance test disguised as divine privilege. Can you withstand the physical demands of the regalia? Can you endure hours of ceremony without faltering? Can you smile benevolently while your body is staging a revolt against the conditions you're subjecting it to? Your ability to suffer gracefully becomes proof of your divine nature. Gods don't complain about heavy crowns. Therefore, if you can bear it without complaint, you must be a god. The logic is circular but effective. Finally, mercifully, the ceremonies conclude and you're escorted back to the palace. The crown comes off, and the relief is so intense it's almost painful in itself, like blood rushing back into a limb that's been compressed too long. Your scalp is tender where the crown's pressure was most intense, and you'll have visible indentations for the next hour. Your neck cracks audibly as you carefully rotate your head, and the servants pretend not to notice. Tomorrow, you'll do this all over again, because there's always another ceremony, another procession, another opportunity to demonstrate divine authority through physical suffering. The priests call it sacred duty. You're starting to call it torture with better costumes. The crown is finally off, and you think maybe, just maybe, you'll get a few moments to yourself, perhaps time to actually rest, or eat a meal without it being a ceremonial performance, or even just sit quietly without priests hovering over you. But that fantasy evaporates the moment your chief steward approaches with the afternoon schedule inscribed on a papyrus scroll that seems to unroll forever. Every hour is accounted for. Every minute has a purpose, and none of it involves you making personal choices about how to spend your time. You're about to discover that being Pharaoh means your entire existence has been outsourced to a bureaucracy of priests, advisors, and ancient protocols that were old when your grandfather's grandfather sat on this throne. The steward begins reading in that monotonous voice that officials use when delivering information you're required to hear but probably won't enjoy. First, there's the afternoon purification ritual, yes, another one, because apparently the morning purification has worn off after 6 hours of existing in the mortal world. Then comes the sacred meal offering to Amun-Ra, which requires your presence even though the actual eating of the food happens only after priests have symbolically fed it to the god statue first. After that, you have an audience with the High Priest of Ptah who needs your approval on temple construction plans. Then there's the judgment session where you'll settle disputes between nobles, or rather, sit on your throne looking wise while your vizier actually settles the disputes, and you nod approvingly at predetermined intervals. The list continues, each item another obligation that transforms your day into an elaborate performance of pharaonic duties. Here's a mainstream historical fact that often surprises people: pharaohs had virtually no privacy. Ever. Every room you enter contains servants, guards, or officials. Even your sleeping chamber has attendants stationed just outside the door, supposedly for your protection, but functionally serving as monitors who report on your nocturnal activities. When you need to relieve yourself, and yes, even gods have bladders, you don't simply walk to a private bathroom. Instead, servants bring an elaborate portable toilet to wherever you are, position screens around you for minimal privacy, and priests perform brief purification prayers before and after. The bathroom activities of the pharaoh apparently require divine oversight. The afternoon purification begins, and you're once again standing naked while priests pour sacred water over you and recite prayers. You've heard these same prayers hundreds, maybe thousands of times. You could probably recite them yourself at this point, but you're not supposed to speak during your own purification. That's the priest's job. Your job is to stand there, arms slightly extended, while they scrub ritually prescribed areas of your body in a ritually prescribed order. Left arm before right arm, chest before back. The sequence matters because everything in Egyptian religion is about order, about maintaining ma'at, about performing actions in the correct sequence to keep the cosmos from descending into chaos. Get the washing order wrong, and theoretically the universe suffers. No pressure. After purification comes redressing, because you can't wear the same ritual garments you wore during the morning's activities. Different times of day require different costumes, different jewellery, different symbolic presentations of your divine authority. The afternoon look involves a different style of royal kilt, a different pectoral collar, and a different headdress, not the full crown. Thank the gods, but still a substantial piece that sits heavily on your freshly washed head. The servants work efficiently, wrapping and positioning and adjusting while you stand like a divine mannequin being prepared for display. Now comes the sacred meal ritual, and you're escorted to the temple of Amun-Ra within the palace complex. This isn't a meal you're going to eat immediately first. The food must be presented to the god. You watch as priests arrange elaborate dishes of roasted duck, fresh bread, dates, figs, and beer on the altar before the massive statue of Amun-Ra. They're chanting prayers that essentially invite the god to partake of the meal's spiritual essence. The food sits there for precisely calculated periods. Historians still argue about whether the timing was based on astronomical calculations or simply traditional practice while you stand nearby. Adding your divine presence to the ceremony, your stomach growls audibly, and you hope the priests are too focused on their chanting to notice that even gods get hungry. Here's a quirky detail about royal meals. By the time food actually reached the pharaoh's mouth, it had typically gone through multiple ritual transformations. First, it was prepared by special cooks who maintained ritual purity. Then it was offered to gods and blessed by priests. Then it was examined by food tasters who checked for poison. Finally, it was served to you with specific protocols about which dishes you should eat first, which utensils to use, and how many bites constituted an appropriate divine portion. A simple lunch required about 2 hours of ceremonial preparation and involved dozens of people. Spontaneous snacking wasn't really an option. The afternoon audience with the High Priest of Ptah finally arrives, and you're seated on your throne, a slightly less elaborate throne than the morning's version, but still uncomfortable while the priest presents architectural plans for temple expansions. He's brought scaled models carved from limestone, detailed drawings on papyrus, and a lengthy explanation of how this construction project will honour the gods and glorify your reign. You're nodding attentively, but here's the secret. You don't actually have much choice in this matter. The priests have already decided what needs to be built. They've already allocated the resources. They've already begun preliminary work. This audience is essentially a formality where you rubber stamp decisions that were made weeks ago by people who understand temple architecture far better than you do. But you can't just say yes, approved, next item please, like you're rushing through paperwork. No. You have to appear thoughtfully engaged, asking wise-sounding questions about foundation depths and stone quality and proper astronomical alignments. The High Priest expects you to demonstrate divine insight into architectural matters. So you make observations that your tutors trained you to make ensure the sanctuary faces the rising sun, or the columns must reflect the proportions of the sacred lotus. These statements are vague enough to sound profound while being specific enough to seem knowledgeable. The priest nods enthusiastically, praising your divine wisdom, and the charade continues. The judgment session is next, and this is where the performance becomes particularly absurd. Two nobles are disputing ownership of a fertile stretch of land along the Nile. They've both brought witnesses, documents, and loud voices to support their claims. They're arguing before your throne, presenting their cases with dramatic gestures and appeals to divine justice. Meanwhile, your vizier, a man who's been managing Egypt's bureaucracy since before you were born, is standing beside your throne, whispering the actual relevant facts into your ear, which noble is more politically important. Which outcome serves Egypt's interests better? What precedents exist from previous judgments? You listen to his whispered guidance while maintaining an expression of godlike contemplation. When you finally pronounce judgment, you're essentially repeating the decision your vizier recommended, but phrased as though divine insight has revealed the truth to you. The evidence speaks through the voice of Ma'at, you declare, which is a fancy way of saying my advisor told me what to do and it sounds reasonable. The successful noble prostrates himself in gratitude for your wisdom. The unsuccessful noble also prostrates himself, accepting divine judgment even though he's clearly furious. Both pretend that you've accessed some cosmic truth rather than simply having a better-informed bureaucrat whispering in your ear. Historians still argue whether pharaohs ever actually exercised independent judgment, or if they were essentially prestigious figureheads for a priestly and bureaucratic apparatus that made all real decisions. The evidence suggests it varied by pharaoh and by historical period. Some were genuinely powerful decision-makers, while others were puppets who performed their assigned roles without questioning the script. Right now, you're somewhere in between, aware enough to recognize the performance, but not powerful enough to change it. The afternoon stretches on with more audiences, more ceremonies, more moments of standing or sitting in prescribed positions while officials conduct the actual business of running Egypt. You're present for everything but in control of nothing. Your schedule continues until evening, when you'll finally get another purification ritual, because by then you've accumulated another day's worth of mortal contamination that must be ritually cleansed. And then tomorrow, you'll do it all again, following the same script, performing the same role, trapped in a cycle of ceremonies that will continue until either you die or Egypt falls. Being pharaoh means being eaten alive by ceremony, one ritualized moment at a time, until there's almost nothing left of the actual person underneath the crown. Evening finally arrives, and you're back in your private chambers for the nightly preparations which, despite the word private, still involve approximately 15 people fussing over you. The servants are removing the day's regalia piece by piece, and you're looking forward to washing your face, except you can't just wash your face like a normal human being. First, the cosmetics must be removed according to proper ritual, and then fresh cosmetics must be applied for the evening, because even in your own quarters, even during the hours technically designated for rest, you must maintain the divine appearance. The servant approaches with a small palette, and you know what's coming more coal. That thick black eye makeup that's been part of pharaonic appearance for thousands of years. It looks dramatic and intimidating in paintings and statues. But what these images don't show you is what that coal is actually doing to your body. The makeup palette contains ground galena lead sulfide mixed with various substances to create that distinctive black colour. The servant uses a small applicator to carefully line your eyes, extending the lines outward in that classic Egyptian style. The coal serves several practical purposes that mainstream historians love to point out. It reduces glare from the intense Egyptian sun. It helps prevent eye infections. The lead has mild antibacterial properties, and it makes your eyes look larger and more striking. All of this is true. What's also true, but discussed less often, is that you're essentially painting lead directly onto the sensitive skin around your eyes, where it gets absorbed into your bloodstream day after day, year after year, slowly accumulating in your bones and organs. Lead poisoning doesn't happen overnight. It's insidious, creeping, gradual. At first, there are no symptoms at all, just the daily ritual of applying coal, looking magnificent, and going about your pharaonic duties. But over months and years, lead accumulates in your body, particularly in your bones, where it can remain for decades. You might start experiencing headaches that seem to come from nowhere. Your stomach might become sensitive, rejecting foods that never bothered you before. You might notice that your thinking feels slightly foggy sometimes, that remembering complex information requires more effort than it used to. These symptoms appear so gradually that you might not even recognize them as symptoms, just the normal wear and tear of being Pharaoh, the exhaustion from endless ceremonies, the stress from managing a kingdom. Here's where it gets darker. As lead continues building up in your system, the symptoms intensify. You might develop joint pain that makes walking uncomfortable. Your kidneys might start struggling to filter toxins effectively. Your blood pressure might rise, putting strain on your heart. In severe cases, and many pharaohs reached severe cases because they wore coal every single day for decades. Lead poisoning causes neurological damage, memory problems, mood changes, irritability, difficulty concentrating. Some historians still argue whether certain pharaohs' erratic behavior in their later years resulted from lead poisoning, psychological stress, or genuine mental illness. The answer might be all of the above, with lead toxicity exacerbating underlying conditions. But tonight, you're young enough that these future horrors are still abstract possibilities rather than present realities. The coal goes on smoothly, making your eyes look striking and godlike in the polished bronze mirror the servant holds up for your inspection. You look powerful, mysterious, eternal, exactly how a pharaoh should look. The fact that this beauty is slowly poisoning you remains unspoken, probably unknown even to the physicians who mix the cosmetics. They know coal is made from galena. They might even know that galena contains lead. But the connection between daily lead exposure and chronic health problems won't be scientifically established for thousands of years. You're participating in an unwitting, civilization-wide experiment in heavy metal toxicity. And it's not just the coal. Your eye makeup is only the most obvious source of lead exposure. That beautiful white face powder that servants apply to lighten your complexion is made from white lead carbonate, which is even more toxic than the galena in your coal. The ancient Egyptians loved the pale, luminous look it created, never realizing they were painting themselves with poison. Some cosmetic palettes also contained compounds of copper and malachite, which added their own toxic contributions to the mixture. You're essentially wearing a chemistry set of heavy metals on your face, all in the name of divine beauty. Here's a quirky detail from medical papyri. Egyptian physicians actually had treatments for some symptoms that we now recognize as lead poisoning stomach remedies, headache treatments, prescriptions for joint pain, but they never connected these ailments to the cosmetics everyone wore daily. The idea that beauty products could cause harm apparently didn't occur to them. Or, if it did, the social and religious importance of proper appearance overrode health concerns. Pharaohs had to look like pharaohs, and that meant coal-lined eyes and lead-whitened skin. Regardless of the consequences, the servants finish your evening cosmetics and move on to hair preparations. Your natural hair has been shaved. Most Egyptian elites kept their heads shaved for cleanliness in the heat, and elaborate wigs are brought out for your inspection. Each wig is a masterpiece of human hair, sometimes imported from Nubia or Libya, woven and braided into complex styles. The wig you choose for evening wear is slightly less formal than your daytime ceremonial wigs, but it's still heavy and hot. It sits on your head like a thick helmet, and within minutes your scalp is sweating underneath it. But going without the wig isn't an option. Even in your private quarters, you're expected to maintain appearances. Even when you're theoretically relaxing, you're still performing the role of pharaoh. Your skin is next in the beautification process. Servants apply scented oils made from myrrh, frankincense, and other precious substances. The oils are meant to moisturize skin dried by the harsh desert climate, and they do work for that purpose. But some of these oil preparations also contain mineral compounds, mercury, antimony, and yes, sometimes more lead that were believed to enhance skin quality. Ancient beauty standards demanded smooth, unblemished, youthful skin, and Egyptian cosmetic artisans used every available substance to achieve that ideal, toxic or not. The servants massage the oils into your arms, your shoulders, your neck, and you try to enjoy the process even though part of your mind is tracking all the chemicals being absorbed through your skin. Historians love to study ancient Egyptian cosmetic recipes because they reveal so much about the culture's values. Trade networks and chemical knowledge. The Egyptians were remarkably sophisticated in creating stable, long-lasting cosmetics from available materials. They understood how to grind minerals to perfect fineness, how to create binding agents that kept pigments from separating, how to add pleasant scents that masked less appealing base odours. Their cosmetic technology was genuinely impressive. They just couldn't have known about chronic toxicity from daily exposure to heavy metals, knowledge of atoms, molecular structures, and bioaccumulation was thousands of years in the future. The evening meal finally arrives, and you're allowed to eat in your chambers rather than in a formal dining hall. This is as close to privacy as you'll get, though. Privacy still includes servants standing ready to refill your cup, guards posted outside your door, and food tasters who've already sampled everything on your plate to ensure it's not poisoned by enemies. You eat slowly, savouring the relative informality, knowing that in a few hours you'll be required to sleep according to schedule because even your rest must align with proper ritual timing. The priests have calculated the optimal hours for the pharaoh's sleep based on astronomical observations and religious texts. Your bedtime isn't chosen by you, it's prescribed by cosmic order. As you eat, you catch your reflection again in a polished metal plate. The coal makes your eyes look magnificent, mysterious, powerful. You look like every statue and painting of pharaohs stretching back through history. You look immortal, and underneath that divine appearance, invisible and insidious, lead is quietly beginning its long work of breaking down your body, one particle at a time. In the name of beauty, you're finally lying down for the night, and just as your mind begins drifting towards something resembling actual sleep, you hear a soft knock on the outer chamber door, followed by hushed voices that immediately snap you back to alertness. Your chief bodyguard enters your sleeping chamber, his face carefully neutral, but you've learned to read the tiny signs of tension in his posture. Someone has requested an urgent audience at this hour, which means it's either genuinely critical or someone is making a power move by demonstrating they can access you at any time. Your heart rate picks up, not from the disturbance itself, but from the realization that hits you every few days. Some of the people closest to you, people you trust with your life and your kingdom, might be actively plotting to kill you. This is the reality that no statue or temple inscription ever depicts pharaohs lived in a constant state of low-grade paranoia, because history proved, over and over again, that the people most likely to murder a king were the people who stood closest to the throne. Your vizier, who whispers advice in your ear during judgments, has access to the entire administrative apparatus of Egypt. Your generals, who command armies in your name, control the organised violence that keeps Egypt secure and could just as easily turn that violence against you. Your relatives, especially your brothers or sons or nephews, have royal blood that gives them potential claim to your throne. Every single one of them is a possible threat. And the worst part is that most of them probably aren't plotting against you at all. But you can never be certain which ones are loyal and which ones are just waiting for the right opportunity. The late-night visitor turns out to be your vizier, and he's bringing news about grain allocations in the Delta region important. Yes, but not exactly the kind of emergency that requires waking the pharaoh. You listen to his report while simultaneously wondering, is this really about grain? Or is he testing something? Is he measuring your reactions, seeing if you're alert or groggy, gathering information that might be valuable to someone planning something? Or are you being paranoid, seeing conspiracies in mundane administrative updates? This is the mental trap that catches every pharaoh. Eventually you can't afford to be too trusting, but you can't afford to be too suspicious either. Trust no one, and you'll alienate the loyal advisors you desperately need. Trust everyone, and you'll end up poisoned or stabbed or quietly removed in one of the dozens of ways that palace coups unfold. Mainstream historical records document multiple pharaohs who were definitely assassinated, and probably many more whose deaths were officially attributed to illness or accident but were actually murders. Amenemhotep was killed in his own bedchamber by conspirators who'd infiltrated his household guards. Ramesses III survived one assassination attempt orchestrated by one of his secondary wives, but died under mysterious circumstances shortly after historians still argue whether he succumbed to delayed effects from the first attack or whether a second, successful attempt was covered up. The list goes on, each entry a reminder that being pharaoh made you simultaneously the most powerful and most vulnerable person in Egypt. Here's what makes the paranoia particularly exhausting. You have to maintain relationships with the very people you suspect. You can't simply arrest your vizier on vague suspicions he might be completely loyal, and removing him would create administrative chaos while signalling to everyone else that you're becoming unstable. You can't exile your ambitious nephew without concrete evidence of plotting he has powerful allies who would turn against you if you acted unjustly. You can't replace your generals with unknown quantities military competence matters, and the enemy you know might be better than the chaos of constant turnover. So you smile at them, you trust them with responsibilities, you eat meals that they could easily have poisoned, and every night you wonder if this will be the night when the plot finally unfolds. Your food tasters provide some security, but they're not perfect. Historians still argue whether some ancient poisons might have been designed to affect only the primary target, perhaps through cumulative doses that wouldn't harm a taster who only ate small portions, or through substances that required specific activation conditions. Egyptian medical texts mention various toxic substances and their effects, suggesting that poisoners had sophisticated knowledge. Your tasters are loyal, probably, but even they could be compromised. Everyone has family members who could be threatened, or ambitions that could be exploited, or prices at which their loyalty might be purchased. The palace itself is a maze of potential vulnerabilities, secret passages built into walls. You know about most of them. Probably. But can you be certain you know about all of them guards stationed outside your chamber? They're sworn to protect you. But there are also human beings with their own debts, grudges, and families. Some pharaohs slept with weapons near their beds, just in case. Others rotated their sleeping locations unpredictably, making it harder for assassins to plan. Some employed multiple layers of guards who didn't know each other, hoping that conspiracy would be harder to organize across disconnected groups. You've implemented several of these precautions yourself, though admitting that openly would mean acknowledging weakness. Here's a quirky detail from palace administrative records. Some pharaohs maintained extensive networks of informants who reported on conversations, alliances, and suspicious activities throughout the palace. These weren't official positions. You wouldn't find royal spy listed in the bureaucratic hierarchy, but certain servants, minor officials, and even priests supplemented their incomes by quietly reporting interesting information to the pharaoh or his most trusted agents. This created a culture where everyone suspected everyone else of being an informant, which may have prevented some conspiracies but also generated an atmosphere of toxic distrust that made genuine loyalty harder to cultivate. Your brother visited the palace yesterday, all smiles and brotherly affection, bearing gifts and offering congratulations on some minor military victory. You embraced him, laughed at his jokes, invited him to dine with you, and the entire time, part of your mind was calculating, does he want the throne? Do his children think they deserve it more than your children? Has anyone approached him with promises of support if he makes a move? He probably noticed you watching him, just as you noticed him watching you, both of you performing brotherhood while mentally mapping the political terrain. Maybe he's completely loyal. Maybe he's actively plotting. Maybe he's considering his options. Not yet committed either way. You'll never know for certain, and that uncertainty will colour every interaction you have with him for the rest of your lives. The generals are perhaps the most dangerous because they control organised violence. A popular general with a loyal army could theoretically march on the palace, and there's not much you could do to stop it if your other forces decided to join him rather than defend you. You try to keep the generals balanced against each other, promoting rivals, rotating commands, ensuring that no single military leader accumulates too much power. But this strategy has its own risks. Generals who feel undervalued might become resentful. Rivals forced to work together might unite against their common obstacle you. There's no perfect solution, just a constant balancing act where you try to maintain enough military loyalty to protect yourself, while preventing any general from becoming powerful enough to threaten you. Then there's the harem situation, which you remember is coming up in your schedule of worries. Multiple wives means multiple sons, and multiple sons means multiple potential successors, each with a mother who's fiercely invested in seeing her child on the throne. You'll deal with that nightmare in detail later, but it's worth noting now because harem conspiracies represent some of the most dangerous threats in Egyptian history. Women who felt their sons were being passed over for succession sometimes organised elaborate plots involving corrupt officials, sympathetic guards, and magical practitioners who supposedly cursed the pharaoh. The harem conspiracy against Ramesses III involved dozens of people and came terrifyingly close to succeeding. You finally dismiss the vizier and lie back down. But sleep is elusive now. Your mind keeps cycling through potential threats, running through scenarios, wondering if you've missed something crucial. Tomorrow you'll wake up and perform divine authority again, projecting confidence and power while internally playing an endless chess game against invisible opponents who may or may not actually exist. Some pharaohs developed genuine paranoid disorders from years of this stress. Others became so hardened and suspicious that they preemptively eliminated potential threats, creating the very atmosphere of conspiracy they feared. A few somehow maintained genuine trust in their inner circles, though whether through wisdom or lucky circumstances, historians can't always determine. The irony is inescapable. You're surrounded by hundreds of people at all times, yet you're profoundly alone. You can't confide genuine fears to anyone because that would reveal vulnerability. You can't ask for honest advice because everyone has agendas. You can't even be certain that tonight's unexpected visitor was really about grain supplies or if it was a test, a probe, the first move in some elaborate game you don't yet understand. Being pharaoh means living inside a golden cage where everyone wants something from you, and some of them might want you dead. Morning arrives with the usual rituals, and after the purifications and dressings and endless ceremonies, you're informed that today you'll be conducting a formal review of the royal harem. This isn't a pleasure visit, those happen on different schedules. Also carefully managed by protocol, this is administrative. You need to assess the children, evaluate the mother's positions, and make decisions about education, marriages, and succession planning. The harem isn't just a collection of wives and concubines, it's a complex political institution housing dozens of women, their children, their servants, and their competing ambitions. Walking into the harem compound feels less like visiting family, and more like entering a nest of beautifully dressed vipers who smile sweetly while mentally calculating how to ensure their particular son becomes the next pharaoh. The harem occupies its own section of the palace complex, a sprawling arrangement of courtyards, private chambers, communal areas, and gardens where the royal women live in comfortable confinement. It's luxurious. Certainly fine linens, elaborate furniture, servants attending to every need, but it's still fundamentally a cage. These women can't leave without permission. They can't conduct their own lives independently. Their entire existence revolves around their relationship to you and the children they've produced. Some of them you married for diplomatic reasons, daughters of foreign kings sent to cement alliances. Others are daughters of powerful Egyptian nobles whose families wanted a connection to the throne. A few you actually chose yourself, back when you were young and thought being Pharaoh meant getting to make decisions about your own romantic life. You enter the main courtyard, and immediately several women approach, prostrating themselves before rising to greet you with practiced grace. These are the senior wives, the ones with established positions in the hierarchy. Your sister wife, the great royal wife, holds the highest rank, but she doesn't live in the harem compound. She has her own palace quarters befitting her status. The women before you now occupy the complicated middle tiers, important enough to have borne your children, connected enough to have political backing, but not quite significant enough to escape the harem system entirely. They're all wearing their finest clothing and jewellery, hair styled elaborately, makeup perfect. They're performing desirability and maternal devotion simultaneously, hoping you'll notice them favourably. Behind them, you can see younger women, newer additions to the harem, watching carefully to understand how this works. There's a girl who can't be more than 15, a Nubian princess sent north as part of a treaty negotiation. She looks terrified and homesick, and you feel a pang of sympathy before remembering that she's also a political asset, a living treaty, and potentially the mother of future sons who might someday claim they deserve your throne. Every person in this compound represents both a human being and a political calculation, and you're expected to balance both perspectives simultaneously. The children are brought forward your sons, ranging from infants carried by nurses to young men in their teens, who eye you with a mixture of respect, fear, and something harder to define. Ambition, maybe. Resentment, possibly. Do you remember that feeling from your own youth? Looking at your father and wondering when it would be your turn? These boys are doing the same thing, except there are too many of them. Mainstream historical records show that some pharaohs fathered dozens of children across multiple wives and concubines. 20, 30, even 40 sons wasn't unusual in large harems. Each one is a potential heir, and each one is also a potential problem. Here's the brutal mathematics of royal succession in ancient Egypt. You need multiple sons as insurance against infant mortality, disease, and accidents. But every son beyond the designated heir becomes a risk factor. They grow up in the palace, learning statecraft and military skills, building relationships with officials and generals, and watching their brother prepare to inherit everything. Some accept this gracefully, others don't. And their mothers, those women standing behind them, smiling at you, are absolutely invested in seeing their specific sons elevated. A mother whose son becomes pharaoh becomes the most powerful woman in Egypt. A mother whose son is passed over becomes irrelevant. Or worse, becomes a potential threat who might be quietly eliminated by the next regime. Your designated heir, the crown prince, stands at the front of the group. He's about 16, already taller than you, wearing the sidelock of youth that marks him as a prince. He bows respectfully, says the appropriate ritual greetings, and maintains perfect posture throughout. On the surface, he's the ideal successor, but you notice things the way some of the other princes watch him with a barely concealed hostility. The way certain mothers whisper to their sons when they think you're not looking. The subtle tensions that run through this gathering like cracks in a clay pot that hasn't been fired properly. This is a conspiracy waiting to happen. The only question is when, and which faction will strike first. Historians still argue about how many pharaohs were actually threatened by their own sons, versus how many became paranoid and saw threats where none existed. The evidence is mixed because successful conspiracies often got written out of official histories, while failed plots might have been exaggerated to justify harsh punishments. What's certain is that father-son conflict was common enough that it shows up repeatedly in royal records, temple inscriptions, and administrative documents. Sons got impatient, fathers got suspicious. The combination could be lethal for one party or the other. You conduct the formal review, asking each prince about his studies, his progress in military training, his understanding of religious duties. It's all very proper and paternal on the surface. Underneath, you're assessing threats. That 12-year-old whose mother is a Hittite princess, does he identify more as Egyptian or Hittite? Could he become a pawn for foreign interests? The 10-year-old twins whose mother comes from a powerful, noble family, are they being groomed as a backup option by nobles who think the current crown prince is unsuitable? The 18-year-old son of a Nubian concubine who's shown remarkable military aptitude, does his capability make him an asset or a danger? Here's a quirky detail from palace administrative records. Royal children's education was carefully monitored and documented, with regular reports submitted about their progress, behaviour, and social connections. These weren't just academic evaluations, they were intelligence reports. Palace officials were watching to see which princes formed alliances with each other, which ones cultivated relationships with influential courtiers, which ones showed signs of excessive ambition or insufficient respect for the crown prince. The surveillance started young, and it never stopped. Growing up as a royal son meant growing up under constant observation, with every friendship and every statement potentially becoming evidence in some future investigation. The mothers are perhaps more dangerous than the sons because they have more experience, better networks, and clearer understanding of how palace politics work. One woman approaches you privately after the formal review, requesting a brief audience. She's the mother of 3 of your sons, none of them currently in line for succession. She speaks carefully, respectfully, but her message is clear. Her elder son has been overlooked for important positions. He deserves a military command or a governorship in a provincial capital. He needs opportunities to prove himself worthy, left unsaid but heavily implied. If he continues being ignored, his supporters might look for other ways to advance his interests. Is this a threat, a warning, or just a mother advocating for her child? You can't be certain, which means you can't respond definitively. You make vague assurances about evaluating all your son's potential, about ensuring everyone receives appropriate opportunities. She bows and withdraws, apparently satisfied, but you know this conversation will repeat in various forms with various mothers over the coming months, each one building her case, advancing her agenda, preparing for succession battles that might not happen for decades, but require planning that starts now. The visit concludes, and you return to the main palace, exhausted from the emotional labour of navigating all those competing interests, while maintaining the appearance of benevolent paternal authority. The harem isn't a pleasure palace despite what future historians might imagine. It's a powder keg filled with ambitious women, rival children, and enough political intrigue to fuel a dozen coups. You're expected to manage it all while also maintaining enough romantic relationships to keep producing heirs, enough political awareness to prevent conspiracies, and enough diplomatic skill to ensure foreign-born wives don't become security risks. Some pharaohs dealt with this nightmare by basically ignoring the harem except for official occasions, which created its own problems as neglected factions grew resentful. Others micromanaged everything, which was exhausting and sometimes counterproductive. A few found genuine companionship with specific wives and essentially created informal inner circles within the harem. Though this risked alienating everyone outside that circle, there's no good solution, just different flavours of dysfunction. You think about Ramesses III again, about the harem conspiracy that nearly killed him, and did kill several officials. The plot involved one of his secondary wives, who decided her son should be Pharaoh instead of the designated heir. She recruited corrupt officials, magic practitioners, and disgruntled guards, They made wax figurines and recited spells meant to weaken the pharaoh. They forged documents and spread rumours. They prepared weapons and planned the actual assassination. The conspiracy was elaborate, well-funded, and came terrifyingly close to succeeding. Ramesses survived, but the investigation revealed dozens of conspirators throughout the palace. The executions that followed were extensive. That could be happening right now in your own harem, and you might not know until it's too late. The women you just smiled at, the children you just reviewed, the servants standing respectfully in the background, any of them could be part of a plot, or none of them could be, and you're just being paranoid. Either way, you'll never know for certain until something happens or doesn't happen, and by then it might be too late to change the outcome. Being Pharaoh means fathering children you can't fully trust, maintaining relationships with women who might be plotting against you, and balancing the need for heirs against the danger that too many heirs creates. It's parenthood and politics and paranoia all tangled together into one exhausting, endless nightmare dressed up as divine privilege. The administrative horrors of the harem are finally behind you for the day, but now comes something arguably worse, the annual inspection of your tomb. Yes, you're still alive, relatively young even, but Egyptian protocol demands that you spend significant portions of your living years obsessing over your death, not just planning for it in an abstract sense, actually visiting the massive construction project that will eventually house your mummified corpse, reviewing architectural plans for your eternal resting place, and making decisions about how you want your body to be imprisoned in stone for the rest of time. You're being escorted through the palace toward the carriages that will take you across the Theban hills to the Valley of the Kings, where thousands of workers have been labouring for years on your tomb, and all you can think is how fundamentally strange it is to inspect your own grave while you're still using your body. The journey to the valley takes about an hour, and you spend the time reviewing reports from your tomb architects. The project started the moment you became pharaoh. It's one of the first things that happens after coronation, as if the entire civilization wants to immediately start planning for your death. The tomb's design is elaborate beyond anything you could fully comprehend, descending corridors cut deep into bedrock. Multiple chambers decorated with religious texts and images. Secret passages meant to confuse grave robbers, and ultimately the burial chamber where your sarcophagus will rest, surrounded by treasures. Tens of thousands of man-hours have already been invested, and the project won't be complete for decades. You're literally spending your life building your own prison. Mainstream historical evidence shows that tomb construction was one of the largest economic activities in ancient Egypt, consuming enormous resources, labour, and artistic talent. The workers weren't slaves. That's a myth that historians have thoroughly debunked, but rather skilled craftsmen, artists, and labourers who lived in dedicated workers' villages and received regular wages. Your tomb project employs hundreds of people directly and supports hundreds more indirectly through supply chains for tools, food, and materials. It's a massive public works program, except the public work is all about creating an elaborate sealed box for your dead body. The carriage arrives at the valley, and you begin the descent into the tomb itself. The entrance is a rectangular cut in the cliff face, leading to a steep corridor that plunges into darkness. Workers have installed torches along the walls, and the flickering light creates dancing shadows that make the hieroglyphic texts seem to move. The air grows cooler as you descend, taking on that peculiar smell of fresh-cut stone, torch smoke, and the slight dampness that accumulates underground. Your chief architect walks beside you. Pointing out recent progress, the corridor has been extended another 20 cubits. The first chamber's ceiling has been smoothed and prepared for decoration. The workers have begun cutting the second descending passage that will lead to deeper levels. You're walking through your own death, essentially, Every surface around you will eventually be covered in texts and images meant to guide your spirit through the afterlife spells from the Book of the Dead, hymns to various deities, maps of the underworld, instructions for navigating the dangerous journey your car will undertake after your body stops breathing. Artists are already at work in completed sections, carefully painting scenes of you making offerings to gods, you being embraced by deities, you transformed into Osiris himself, reborn and eternal. It's beautiful work, technically masterful and utterly focused on you being dead. Here's where the existential horror really sets in. You know exactly what's going to happen to your body after death because the mummification process is well documented, thoroughly ritualized, and completely unavoidable. There's no opt-out for pharaohs. Your body will be taken to the Pernefair, the house of beauty where embalmers work. They'll lay you on a stone table and begin the 70-day process of transforming you from a corpse into a preserved vessel for your car. First, they'll make an incision in your left side and remove your internal organs, liver, lungs, stomach, intestines, placing them in canopic jars. Your heart stays inside because you'll need it for the judgment of the dead. But everything else comes out. Then comes the part that particularly disturbs you, the brain removal. The embalmers will insert a long bronze hook up through your nose, into your skull, and systematically break up your brain tissue so it can be extracted through your nasal cavity. The ancient Egyptians didn't think the brain was particularly important. They believed consciousness resided in the heart, so they just throw the brain away. All your thoughts, memories, everything that makes you you in a neurological sense, will be hooked out through your nose and discarded. The priest performing this procedure will chant prayers the entire time, sanctifying the desecration, turning physical violation into religious ritual. Historians still argue about whether pharaohs found comfort in the elaborate afterlife preparations, or if they were quietly horrified by the whole process, but couldn't express it without undermining the entire religious framework that legitimized their rule. The textual evidence is ambiguous because official inscriptions always present pharaohs as serenely confident in their eternal destiny, but some personal letters and private documents hint at genuine anxiety about death and the afterlife, suggesting that at least some pharaohs wrestled with the same existential fears as anyone else, just with much more elaborate funeral arrangements. The architect leads you deeper into the tomb, down to what will eventually be your burial chamber. It's a massive space, its ceiling supported by columns that are being carved to resemble papyrus bundles. The walls are bare stone right now, waiting for the artists who will cover every surface with protective spells and religious scenes. In the centre of the chamber, workers are preparing the depression where your massive stone sarcophagus will eventually rest. You stand at the edge, looking down into what will be your final bed, and the reality hits you with physical force. This hole in the ground is where you'll spend eternity. Not metaphorically, actually. Your body will lie right here, in darkness, forever. After your brain is removed and your organs are stored, the embalmers will pack your body cavity with natron, a natural salt that desiccates tissue. You'll lie covered in natron for 40 days while the salt draws out all moisture, essentially turning you into human jerky. Your skin will darken and harden, your features will become gaunt and skeletal. The embalmers will periodically inspect the process, adding more natron, ensuring complete desiccation. Once you're thoroughly dried, they'll remove the natron, wash your body with palm wine and water from the Nile, and begin the wrapping process. Here's a quirky detail from embalming manuals. The wrapping of a pharaoh's mummy was an elaborate ritual that could use hundreds of yards of linen and take several days to complete. Each finger and toe was wrapped individually first, then the limbs, then the torso. Between layers, priests inserted protective amulets, scarabs, deed pillars, wadjet eyes, each one blessed and positioned according to precise ritual requirements. The wrapping wasn't just preservation, it was armour. magical protection for your journey through the underworld. But it was also bondage, imprisoning you in layers of fabric so tight and complete that you'd be unable to move, even if consciousness somehow persisted in your mummified flesh. Your architect is explaining something about drainage systems to prevent water infiltration, but you're barely listening. You're imagining being sealed inside that stone sarcophagus, which will itself be sealed inside the burial chamber, which will be sealed behind massive stone blocks meant to deter thieves. Layer after layer of barriers between your corpse and the outside world. The priests believe your car will be able to come and go freely, nourished by offerings brought to your mortuary temple. But what if they're wrong? What if consciousness somehow persists in the mummy, trapped in dried flesh that can't move, in darkness that never ends, in silence broken only by the occasional sounds of stone settling, or worse, grave robbers breaking in? The historical record is full of violated tombs. Grave robbing wasn't just common in ancient Egypt. It was practically an industry. Thieves developed elaborate techniques for breaking into sealed tombs, avoiding traps, and extracting valuable grave goods. Even tombs in the Valley of the Kings, supposedly the most secure burial ground in Egypt, were robbed extensively, sometimes within years of the pharaoh's burial. Sometimes, evidence suggests, by the very workers who built the tombs and knew their layouts. Your elaborate security measures the hidden doors, the false chambers. The massive stone blocks might delay robbers but probably won't stop them permanently. So you're spending enormous resources building a tomb that will likely be robbed, to house a body that will be mutilated during mummification, to support an afterlife that requires continuous offerings which will eventually stop when your mortuary cult runs out of funding or Egypt itself falls. The whole enterprise is designed to last for eternity, but historical evidence shows that most pharaonic mortuary cults collapsed within a few generations. Your eternal destiny depends on people thousands of years from now continuing to bring you offerings, and that's simply not going to happen. Eventually, inevitably, your car will starve in the afterlife because nobody remembers to feed you. But you can't voice these doubts. You're supposed to be serene about death, confident in the Egyptian afterlife, focused on proper preparation for your eternal destiny. So you nod approvingly at the architect's explanations. You make decisions about wall decorations and sarcophagus designs. You authorize additional spending for higher quality materials. You perform the role of a pharaoh who believes completely in the system, even while part of your mind is screaming at the absurdity of spending decades building an elaborate prison for your corpse. The inspection finally ends, and you emerge back into daylight, blinking in the bright sun that suddenly feels precious because you're reminded it won't shine on you forever. You have maybe 20, 30, 40 more years if you're lucky and avoid assassins and don't succumb to disease. And you'll spend significant portions of that time continuing to build this tomb, continuing to plan your own death, continuing to participate in a civilization-wide denial of mortality that somehow requires obsessively preparing for it. Being Pharaoh means living in death's shadow, spending your life building the monument to your corpse, and knowing far too much about exactly how your body will be violated and preserved, and ultimately abandoned in darkness. It's not eternal life. It's eternal death with extra steps and better decorations. You're back at the palace, trying to recover from the existential nightmare of inspecting your own tomb, when your chamberlain approaches with a reminder that makes your stomach drop. The said festival is only 5 years away, and preparations need to begin immediately. The said festival, that elaborate ceremony that supposedly rejuvenates the pharaoh and proves his continued fitness to rule, is coming, and with it comes the physical ordeal that has broken pharaohs before you. It's traditionally celebrated after 30 years of rule. Though some pharaohs adjusted the timing based on various justifications, you've been on the throne for 25 years now, and the countdown to the most grueling test of your reign has officially begun. You're expected to demonstrate physical vitality that you're honestly not certain you still possess, all while maintaining divine dignity and proving to Egypt that you're still worthy of the crown. The said festival wasn't just a party or a religious ceremony, it was a test, a trial, a public demonstration of the pharaoh's continued capability. Mainstream historical records describe elaborate rituals lasting several days, involving processions, offerings, and multiple ceremonies at temples throughout the capital. But the centerpiece, the moment that everyone watched and remembered, it was the physical run. You, the pharaoh, had to complete a ritual course while wearing full royal regalia, demonstrating that you still possessed the strength and stamina to rule Egypt effectively. In theory, a pharaoh who failed this test could be replaced. In practice, pharaohs who felt they might fail sometimes cancelled the festival, adjusted the requirements, or simply died before reaching 30 years of rule, making the whole question moot. You're 50-something years old now, not ancient by any measure, but definitely feeling the accumulated wear of 25 years performing the role of divine monarch. Your neck has permanent issues from decades of wearing heavy crowns. Your knees ache from years of climbing temple stairs and standing through endless ceremonies. That lead-laced coal you've been wearing daily has probably caused some level of chronic poisoning, though you don't think about that too directly. And now you're supposed to run a ceremonial course, in full regalia, while thousands watch to see if their pharaoh is still fit, or if Egypt needs a younger, stronger god-king. The Chamberlain is outlining the preparation schedule, special diets to improve your stamina, daily exercise regimens supervised by priests who supposedly understand the relationship between physical fitness and divine favour, consultations with physicians about herbs and treatments that might enhance performance. It all sounds exhausting before you've even started, and you realise this is going to consume the next 5 years of your life. Every meal will be calculated for optimal energy. Every spare moment will involve some form of physical conditioning. Your entire existence will be oriented toward passing a test that your 30-year-old self would have handled easily, but your current self finds genuinely intimidating. Here's what the temple reliefs don't show you about the said festival run the terror. Not just the physical challenge, though that's real enough, but the political stakes. If you stumble during the run, if you appear weak or winded or unable to complete the course, it becomes evidence that Mayat is disrupted, that cosmic order is breaking down, that maybe Egypt needs a new pharaoh. Your rivals will watch that run like hawks examining prey. Your heir will be calculating whether your visible weakness creates an opportunity. The priest will be interpreting every stumble as divine commentary on your worthiness. Thousands of ordinary Egyptians will be drawing conclusions about whether the gods still favour you or if your time is ending. Historians still argue about how rigorous the said festival run actually was versus how much it got ritualised and simplified over time. Some evidence suggests early dynasties required genuinely athletic performances, actual running that tested real physical fitness. Later periods might have transformed it into more symbolic movements. Short walks or ceremonial gestures that preserve the form while reducing the physical demands. But you can't be certain which version you're expected to perform until the actual festival arrives. And preparing for the easier version while the kingdom expects the harder version would be catastrophic. The course itself is laid out in a specific pattern, supposedly replicating the boundaries of Egypt that the pharaoh symbolically runs to claim and reclaim the entire kingdom. You'll need to complete multiple circuits, visiting stations representing Upper and Lower Egypt, demonstrating that you can still physically encompass the realm. The exact distance varies by location and tradition, but estimates suggest anywhere from a few hundred yards to over a mile of actual movement, all while wearing that absurd regalia that's heavy and hot and designed for looking divine rather than for athletic performance. Your trainers begin the conditioning program, and it's immediately humiliating. Exercises that you could have performed effortlessly decades ago now leave you breathing heavily and sweating through your royal linen. They've designed circuits that supposedly mimic the festival course. And your first attempt at completing one is embarrassing enough that you insist on privacy for future training sessions. You can't have servants and officials watching the Pharaoh struggle with basic physical tasks. It undermines the entire divine mystique that holds your position together, so you train in secured areas, with only a handful of absolutely trusted attendants present, all of whom have been thoroughly warned that discussing the Pharaoh's training difficulties would be very bad for their continued employment and possibly their lives. Here's a quirky detail from medical papyri. Egyptian physicians had various treatments they believed enhanced physical performance, herbal mixtures, dietary regimens, even magical spells that supposedly granted strength and endurance. Your doctors are preparing all of these for you, and you're desperately willing to try anything that might help. Some of the herbs probably do have mild stimulant effects. Ancient Egyptians weren't completely wrong about pharmacology. But the magical spells are clearly nonsense, and you know it. Yet you recite them anyway because at this point you need every possible advantage, real or imagined. The psychological pressure intensifies as the months pass and the festival draws closer. You're training daily now, pushing your aging body through routines that leave you exhausted and sore. Your physicians monitor your progress, offering encouraging words that don't quite mask their concern. Your trainers adjust the program repeatedly, trying to find the balance between building your stamina and not injuring you in preparation. Meanwhile, palace gossip undoubtedly includes speculation about whether you'll successfully complete the said festival, or if this might be the beginning of the end of your reign. Your heir visits occasionally, ostensibly to pay respects, but really to assess your condition. He's in his 30s now, prime of life, physically capable, and increasingly impatient. He doesn't say anything explicit that would be treasonous, but his eyes track your movements, noting any signs of weakness or fatigue. You catch him watching when you unconsciously rub your aching knees after training, and you see the calculation happening behind his expression. If you fail the said festival, what happens next? Does he wait patiently for you to die naturally? Or does the failed festival become justification for accelerating the succession? The festival preparations expand beyond just your physical training. Temples throughout Egypt are being notified, so they can prepare for the celebrations and send representatives. Diplomatic messages are being sent to foreign kingdoms, inviting them to send observers who will witness your continued vitality and report back that Egypt remains strong under your rule. Enormous resources are being allocated for the feast, the decorations, the offerings, the 1,000 details that transform a religious ceremony into a statement of power and continuity. And underneath all the pageantry, you're just a middle-aged person trying desperately to pass a fitness test that has political implications far beyond the physical challenge itself. You're running practice circuits in private courtyards, breathing hard, feeling your heart pound, wondering if your body can hold up for just one more major performance. The crown you'll wear during the actual run sits on a stand in your chamber, and you look at it sometimes with something approaching hatred. That object has caused you decades of headaches, neck pain, and now it's going to sit on your head while you try to prove you're not too old to be Pharaoh. Some nights you lie awake calculating alternatives. What if you simply declared the festival a success based on abbreviated ceremonies, but that would look weak and might spark exactly the succession crisis you're trying to avoid? What if you delayed the festival again, pushing it back another few years, but there are limits to how long you can postpone before it becomes obvious you're afraid of failing? What if you just refused the whole tradition, declared it outdated, reformed the system? But thousands of years of precedent can't be dismissed without undermining the entire religious framework that legitimizes your authority. So you'll train, and you'll prepare, and when the time comes you'll put on that heavy crown, and all the regalia, and you'll run or walk or ceremonially move through that course. And the entire kingdom will watch to see if their god king can still function in the role. And if you succeed, you buy yourself more time, maybe another said festival in a few more years, maybe decades more of rule. And if you fail, well, you'll find out exactly how quickly divine favour can evaporate when the god starts looking too human. Being Pharaoh means spending years preparing to prove you're still worthy of being Pharaoh, turning your own physical fitness into a political crisis, and knowing that eventually, inevitably, your body will betray you in public and the performance will finally end. The only questions are when and how catastrophically. The physical preparations for your said festival continue grinding away at your body. But this morning brings a different kind of crisis, one that strikes directly at the foundation of your divine authority. Your chief priest enters during your morning meal with an expression that immediately puts you on alert. The Nile's flood levels are lower than expected this year, significantly lower. The annual inundation that makes Egypt possible, that turns the narrow river valley into a breadbasket capable of supporting millions, is failing. And according to every religious text, every temple inscription, every bit of pharaonic propaganda that legitimizes your rule, this is fundamentally, cosmically, personally your fault. The Egyptian worldview made the pharaoh responsible for Ma'at cosmic order, balance, justice, and the proper functioning of the universe itself. When things went well, it proved the pharaoh was maintaining Ma'at successfully. When things went badly, it meant the pharaoh was failing in his divine duties. The Nile flood was the most visible, most critical measure of this cosmic order. A good flood meant abundant harvests, full granaries, prosperous Egypt, and proof that the gods approved of their earthly representative. A poor flood meant crop failures, food shortages, economic crisis, and clear evidence that something was wrong with the pharaoh's relationship to divine order. There was no escaping this logic once you accepted the premise, and you couldn't reject the premise without undermining the entire justification for pharaonic rule. Mainstream historical evidence shows that ancient Egyptians tracked Nile flood levels obsessively, keeping detailed records that stretched back centuries. Nilometers measured the water's height, and these measurements were reported to the pharaoh and recorded in administrative documents. A flood level of 16 to 18 cubits was ideal enough water to irrigate fields without causing destructive flooding. Below 14 cubits meant inadequate irrigation and potential famine. Above 20 cubits meant catastrophic flooding that destroyed villages and infrastructure. You're currently looking at preliminary reports suggesting this year's flood might barely reach 13 cubits. That's disaster territory, and everyone will interpret it as evidence of your personal unworthiness. The priest is explaining the situation with careful diplomatic language, but the subtext is clear: the gods are displeased. Maybe you've neglected some ritual obligation. Maybe you've allowed Matt to become disrupted through inadequate attention to justice. Maybe your own fitness to rule is being questioned by the divine powers that control the Nile's source. He's not quite saying you should abdicate or that succession should be accelerated, but he's dancing around those implications while ostensibly just delivering meteorological news. Because in Egypt, there's no such thing as just weather. Every environmental condition is a theological statement about the pharaoh's worthiness. Here's the political trap: you can't actually control the Nile flood. Obviously, you're a human being, not a supernatural entity, despite the propaganda that says otherwise. The flood depends on rainfall patterns in the Ethiopian highlands, thousands of miles south of Egypt, where water collects and eventually flows north to inundate the Egyptian floodplain. You have absolutely no influence over whether it rains in Ethiopia, but you can't admit that publicly because doing so would mean acknowledging that the pharaoh isn't actually maintaining cosmic order, which would undermine the entire religious and political system that keeps you in power. So you're trapped in a position where you're held responsible for things completely beyond your control, and any failure of nature becomes interpreted as your personal failing. Your response has to be immediate and visible. You order increased offerings at all major temples, massive quantities of food, incense, and valuable goods presented to the gods with prayers for their favour. You commission new statues and inscriptions declaring your piety and devotion. You personally participate in additional rituals, spending hours in temples making offerings and reciting prayers that supposedly influence divine favour. None of this will actually affect rainfall in Ethiopia or water levels in the Nile, but it demonstrates that you're taking the crisis seriously and doing everything a pharaoh is supposed to do when cosmic order seems disrupted. The economic implications are catastrophic if the flood stays low. Egypt's entire agricultural system depends on that annual inundation depositing fresh silt and providing irrigation water. Without adequate flooding, crop yields plummet. Without adequate crops, people go hungry. Hungry people become desperate. Desperate people become angry. And angry people start questioning whether maybe the gods are sending a message about their supposed divine representative. You've seen this pattern in historical records. Low Nile floods correlate strongly with periods of political instability, rebellions, and sometimes the complete collapse of dynasties. Pharaohs who couldn't deliver good floods often didn't remain pharaohs for very long. Historians still argue about how much ancient Egyptians actually believed their pharaoh controlled natural phenomena, versus how much was cynical political theatre that everyone understood but pretended to accept. The evidence is genuinely mixed. Some inscriptions read like sincere religious belief pharaohs praying desperately for divine intervention, expressing genuine anxiety about their responsibilities to maintain Maat. Other documents suggest a more pragmatic understanding, with administrators and priests discussing flood patterns, agricultural planning, and economic policies that acknowledge natural variability while maintaining the public fiction of pharaonic control. Your vizier arrives with preliminary impact assessments. If the flood stays at current predicted levels, grain yields will drop by approximately 30%. The granaries have reserve supplies from previous good years, so immediate famine isn't inevitable. But those reserves will be depleted rapidly. Prices will rise, which will hit the poorest Egyptians hardest. There will be increased pressure on the irrigation system, requiring labour mobilisation for well digging and canal maintenance. Foreign trade might be affected if Egypt can't export surplus grain as usual. The entire economic engine that makes Egyptian civilization function will start sputtering. And again, everyone will interpret this as evidence of your failing divine mandate. Here's a quirky detail from administrative records. Some pharaohs apparently tried to manipulate nilometer readings or suppress bad news about flood levels, hoping to manage public perception and delay panic. Officials responsible for taking measurements faced enormous pressure to report favourable numbers, and there are hints in surviving documents that creative accounting sometimes occurred. Of course, you can't fake an actual crop failure when it happens, so any manipulation of flood data only delayed the inevitable reckoning. But desperate pharaohs sometimes grasped at any strategy that might buy time or deflect blame. You convene an emergency council with your vizier, high priests, and senior administrators to develop response strategies. The priests argue for more religious ceremonies if divine displeasure caused the low flood. Divine favour must be courted through proper ritual. Your vizier advocates for practical measures redistributing granary reserves, organising labour for emergency irrigation projects, preparing for food rationing if necessary. Your treasurer worries about the economic impact and potential civil unrest. Everyone's talking at once, and you're supposed to make wise decisions that will somehow prevent or mitigate a crisis that's fundamentally rooted in rainfall patterns you can't control. The political opportunism starts immediately. Rival factions within the court begin subtle campaigns suggesting that maybe a different pharaoh would have better relationships with the gods. Religious conservatives hint that perhaps you've been too lax in maintaining traditional rituals. Your designated heirs supporters quietly suggest that younger, more vital leadership might restore divine favour, conveniently aligning the low Nile with your upcoming Sed festival as evidence that succession should be accelerated. Nobody's directly calling for your removal yet, but the groundwork is being laid for that argument if conditions worsen. You're also aware that foreign kingdoms will hear about Egypt's problems and draw their own conclusions. A weak Egypt is an Egypt that might be attacked, invaded, or, at minimum, treated less respectfully in diplomatic negotiations. The Hittites, the various Canaanite city-states, the Nubians, they all watch for signs of Egyptian weakness. A major crop failure caused by low Nile flooding is exactly the kind of weakness that emboldens enemies and undermines alliances. You'll need to project strength externally while managing crisis internally. Another impossible balancing act. The next several months are going to be consumed by crisis management. You'll spend countless hours in temples performing rituals that probably won't help, but that you can't afford not to perform. You'll oversee administrative responses to agricultural shortfalls. You'll manage political fallout from economic stress. And through all of it, you'll maintain the public position that you're successfully fulfilling your role as divine Pharaoh, maintaining cosmic order, even while privately dealing with the reality that you're just a person trying to manage natural disasters that ancient theology has decided are somehow your fault. There's a horrible irony in being held responsible for the Nile flood while simultaneously being worshipped as a god. If you really were divine, you could just fix the problem, but you're not. You can't, and admitting that would destroy the entire system. So you're stuck performing divinity, taking responsibility for natural phenomena beyond anyone's control, and hoping that next year's flood returns to normal levels before your political position becomes completely untenable. Being Pharaoh means being blamed for droughts you didn't cause, managing famines you couldn't prevent, and maintaining the fiction of divine control over a natural world that operates according to its own patterns regardless of who sits on the throne. It's cosmic responsibility without actual power, accountability without agency, and the divine mandate to fix problems that gods themselves apparently can't manage. The Nile crisis continues grinding away at your political credibility, but today brings a different kind of horror, one that's more personal and infinitely more visceral. You're standing in the Père Néfer, the house of beauty where embalmers practice their craft, because your chief priest insisted you needed to observe the mummification of a recently deceased high official. This visit is supposedly educational, meant to deepen your understanding of the sacred processes that await you, but really it feels like being forced to preview your own autopsy. The smell hits you first, natron salt, incense burning to mask other odours, and underneath it all the unmistakable scent of death and preservation chemicals. You're watching what will eventually happen to your own body, and every detail is more disturbing than the sanitized religious texts ever suggested. The official's body lies on a stone table, already in the early stages of preparation. The embalmer priests work with practiced efficiency, their hands steady as they perform procedures that would be considered horrific violations in any other context. But here, framed by religious ritual and sacred purpose, these acts become holy. One priest is making a careful incision along the left side of the abdomen, the cut through which they'll remove the internal organs. You watch the bronze blade slice through skin and muscle, revealing the visceral reality of human anatomy in ways that temple reliefs never depict. The dead official can't feel anything, obviously, but you're imagining this happening to you, and your stomach lurches. Mainstream historical records describe mummification as a 70-day process involving multiple stages, each with specific religious significance. What those dry historical accounts don't convey is how physically invasive and thorough the procedure actually is. You're watching as the priests extract the liver, carefully removing it and placing it in a canopic jar. Then the lungs, the stomach, the intestines, each organ handled reverently but also matter-of-factly, like butchers preparing meat except with prayers instead of recipes. The heart stays inside the body cavity, because Egyptian theology holds that consciousness and personality reside in the heart, and you'll need it for the judgment of the dead. But everything else comes out, and you're confronted with the reality that you are apparently just this collection of parts that can be separated, preserved in different containers, and theoretically reassembled in the afterlife. Then comes the brain removal, and you almost ask to leave but can't without appearing weak or impious. The embalmer priest selects a long bronze hook with a slightly bent end. It looks like a tool for fishing or clearing drains, which is basically what it is, except the drain is your skull. He inserts the hook carefully into the corpse's nostril, angling it upward into the nasal cavity and then into the skull itself. There's a slight cracking sound as the ethmoid bone breaks, and then the hook is inside the cranial vault. The priest begins stirring, breaking up brain tissue so it can be extracted. It's methodical, practiced, efficient, and absolutely horrifying to watch. Brain matter eventually drains out through the nose, liquefied and essentially discarded. All your thoughts, memories, the neurological basis of everything you are, will be hooked out and thrown away because ancient Egyptian theology decided the brain was unimportant. Here's a quirky medical detail that makes this worse. Egyptian embalmers were actually quite skilled anatomists through practice, but they completely misunderstood the brain's function. They thought it was essentially mucus-producing tissue with no particular importance. The heart was the seat of thought, emotion, and personality in their understanding, while the brain was just material that needed to be removed to aid preservation. So they developed elaborate, skilled techniques for brain removal without ever recognizing they were destroying the organ that actually generated consciousness. You're watching your culture's fundamental misunderstanding of neurology being literally demonstrated on a corpse. The body cavity is now empty except for the heart, and the priests begin packing it with natron, this naturally occurring salt mixture, harvested from dry lake beds, has powerful desiccating properties. They stuff it into the abdominal cavity, pack it around the remaining organs, and then cover the entire body with mounds of natron. The corpse will rest like this for 40 days, while the salt draws out all moisture from the tissues. You've read descriptions of this process, but seeing the sheer quantity of natron required makes it real. The body essentially becomes a human-shaped salt lick, and when the process completes, what emerges will be dried, darkened, hardened, radically transformed from a recently living person into something that looks disturbingly like leather. Historians still argue about whether mummification actually preserved consciousness or awareness in any way, or whether it was purely physical preservation meant to provide an anchor for the car's spiritual double to return to. Egyptian religious texts are ambiguous on this point, sometimes suggesting the preserved body is just a vessel, other times implying some continuity of experience through the mummification process. You really hope it's the former, because the idea of being conscious in any way during brain removal, or organ extraction, or 40 days of desiccation is the stuff of nightmares. The chief priest is explaining the religious significance of each step, how the removal of organs represents spiritual purification, how the natron preservation parallels the god Osiris's own transformation, how the wrapping that will come later provides magical protection for your journey through the underworld. It's all very meaningful and symbolic, and you're nodding appropriately while internally screaming because regardless of the spiritual significance, you're watching a demonstration of how your physical body will be systematically disassembled and transformed. The religious framework doesn't make the physical reality less disturbing. It just provides a narrative that makes the disturbing parts seem necessary. The embalmer priest shows you some of the tools they'll use in later stages, the special curved needles for sewing the abdominal incision closed after natron treatment. The thin hooks for pulling linen through tight spaces during wrapping, various implements for positioning and adjusting the limbs during the final stages. Each tool is blessed and consecrated, transforming what would otherwise be craft tools into sacred instruments. You're handed one of the needles to examine, and the weight of it feels wrong in your hand because you know this exact needle, or one very like it, will someday pierce your own preserved skin, threading linen through your dried flesh to seal you up for eternity. Here's what really gets you, though the complete thoroughness of it all. Egyptian mummification isn't a quick, simple preservation process. It's exhaustive, invasive, transformative. They'll remove almost everything that makes your body function. They'll drain you of fluids, pack you with chemicals, cover you with preservatives. They'll position your limbs in prescribed postures, wrap you in hundreds of yards of linen, insert protective amulets between the wrapping layers. They'll paint you with resins and oils. They'll fit you with a decorative mask that doesn't really look like you, but represents an idealized, divine version of you. By the time they're finished, you won't be you in any recognizable physical sense. You'll be an artifact, a religious object, a preserved vessel meant to last for eternity, whether you want it to or not. The priests are now demonstrating how they'll apply the wrapping after the natron treatment completes. They've brought practiced linen, and they're showing the precise technique, wrapping each finger individually first, then the hands, then the arms, layer upon layer with prayers and amulets inserted at specific points. The wrapping has to be tight enough to maintain the body's shape, but not so tight it causes the brittle, dried tissue to crack. It's a skilled craft passed down through generations, and you're watching master practitioners demonstrate techniques they'll eventually use on you. They're proud of their expertise, explaining the variations in wrapping styles for different body parts, the specific prayers associated with each layer, the optimal positioning of protective amulets. You thank them for the demonstration and exit as soon as protocol allows, stepping back into the Egyptian sunlight and trying not to think about how that sunlight won't reach you once you're wrapped, boxed, sealed, and buried. Your body will rest in permanent darkness, preserved indefinitely, locked inside its tomb while the world moves on without you. The priests believe your car will be able to travel freely between your tomb and the land of the living, nourished by offerings brought to your mortuary temple. But your physical body, or what's left of it after mummification, will stay trapped in that sarcophagus forever, or at least until grave robbers break in and disturb your rest. Being Pharaoh means knowing in vivid, disturbing detail exactly what will be done to your body after death, understanding the full invasive reality of mummification while maintaining the public position that this is a sacred honor you're eagerly anticipating. It means watching demonstrations of brain removal and organ extraction and forced preservation, then walking back to your palace and pretending you find the whole process comforting rather than horrifying, is previewing your own violation and calling it eternal life. The mummification demonstration has left you unsettled for days, but now comes another dimension of your posthumous existence that's somehow even more anxiety-inducing: the economics of the afterlife. Your chief mortuary priest is presenting the annual budget for your funerary cult, the ongoing operation that will supposedly sustain your KA in the afterlife through perpetual offerings. The numbers are staggering. Enormous amounts of resources are being allocated not just for your tomb construction, which you've already reviewed, but for the permanent endowment that will fund daily offerings. Maintain your mortuary temple, pay priests to perform rituals, and theoretically continue doing all of this forever. Except forever is a long time, and you're starting to understand that your eternal destiny depends on an economic system that probably can't sustain itself for more than a few generations. Egyptian theology is very specific about what happens to your KR after death. It needs regular nourishment food, beer, incense brought daily to your mortuary temple, and symbolically transferred to you in the afterlife. Miss those offerings and your KR starves, literally starve, according to religious texts. experiencing eternal hunger and deprivation because nobody's feeding you. The system was designed to ensure that pharaohs established elaborate mortuary cults before they died, endowing them with agricultural land, workers, and resources that would generate income to support offerings in perpetuity. Your cult has been operating in preparation mode for years already, accumulating assets and establishing the infrastructure that will supposedly function for thousands of years after you're gone. Mainstream historical evidence shows that most mortuary cults collapsed within a few generations of the pharaoh's death. The endowed lands got reassigned by later pharaohs who needed resources for their own projects. The priests drifted away to more lucrative positions serving living rulers rather than dead ones. The temples fell into disrepair. The offerings stopped, and presumably, if the theology was correct, the cars of those pharaohs began starving in the afterlife because the economic engine supporting them had broken down. You're looking at budget projections that assume perpetual operation, but you know enough history to understand that perpetual in practice means maybe 3 generations if you're lucky, possibly less if political circumstances change. Here's the trap. You need to establish a mortuary cult because not doing so would be admitting you don't believe in the afterlife, which would undermine the entire religious framework that legitimizes pharaonic rule. But you also know, based on historical precedent, that this cult will eventually fail and your KA will be abandoned. So you're investing enormous resources into a system you suspect is fundamentally unsustainable, because the alternative is undermining the theological basis of your own authority. It's a civilization-wide denial of mortality's finality, dressed up as eternal life planning, funded by economic models that can't actually deliver what they promise. The priest is explaining the asset portfolio extensive agricultural land in the Delta region, producing grain that will be sold to fund ongoing operations, workshops producing bread, beer, and other offerings, contracts with specific families who've agreed to provide hereditary service as mortuary priests. Their descendants will supposedly continue performing rituals for your KA generations from now. Backup endowments invested in temple properties that should provide income even if some assets fail. It's genuinely sophisticated financial planning, and it's all built on the assumption that social and political structures will remain stable enough to honour these arrangements indefinitely. But you've studied enough history to know that Egypt itself has collapsed before. The Old Kingdom fell apart during the First Intermediate Period, and mortuary cults from that era basically ceased functioning entirely. The Middle Kingdom had similar disruptions. Even within stable periods, resources get redirected, priorities change, and dead pharaohs gradually become less important than living ones who control actual power. Your mortuary cult might function well for 20 or 30 years after your death, when memories of your reign are still fresh and your immediate successors feel obligated to maintain it. But 50 years out, 100, when you're just another name in a long list of dead pharaohs, and your great-great-grandson is on the throne dealing with his own problems, why would anyone prioritize feeding your Ka historians, still argue about whether ancient Egyptians genuinely believed the offering system worked, or if there was quiet skepticism hidden beneath public piety? Some texts suggest real anxiety about eternal hunger pharaohs writing elaborate contracts and curses trying to ensure offerings would continue, as if they understood the system was fragile and needed supernatural enforcement to supplement economic arrangements. Other documents show a more pragmatic approach, with pharaohs essentially hoping for the best while recognizing they couldn't actually control what happened after they died. You're somewhere between those positions, performing confidence in the system while privately doubting its long-term viability. The priest shows you the daily offering menu that's been designed for your Kea fresh bread, roasted meats, vegetables, beer, wine, incense, oils. It's essentially a feast, delivered symbolically every single day, forever. The food will actually be prepared and brought to your mortuary temple, where priests will place it before your statue and perform rituals transferring its spiritual essence to you in the afterlife. Then, crucially, the physical food will be distributed to the priests as payment they get to eat it, which provides them with incentive to continue the system. It's actually clever economics. The food offerings serve both religious and practical purposes, theoretically making the system more sustainable because the priests directly benefit from maintaining it. But here's a quirky detail that undermines even that clever arrangement. As generations pass and the food budget gets tighter, offerings get smaller and less frequent. Records from long-established mortuary cults show a pattern of gradual decline. Daily offerings become weekly, then monthly, then sporadic, then eventually stop entirely. The priests still perform abbreviated rituals occasionally, going through the motions without actual offerings, and eventually even that stops. Your elaborate daily feast will probably devolve into token gestures within decades, and then nothing within a century or two. And you, if consciousness persists in any form, will experience the slow starvation of your car as the offerings decline and eventually cease. The theology offers one small comfort offering. Formulas inscribed on your tomb walls supposedly provide magical sustenance if physical offerings fail. The hieroglyphic texts listing foods and offerings can supposedly manifest spiritually, feeding your KA through symbolic representation rather than actual delivery. It's a backup system, recognizing that physical offerings might not continue indefinitely, but even this magical solution depends on your tomb remaining intact and accessible. If grave robbers destroy your inscriptions, or if your tomb collapses or gets sealed permanently, even the magical backup fails. Your eternal sustenance rests on stone walls and economic systems, both of which are far more fragile than eternal implies. You're also aware that creating your mortuary cult means diverting resources from other priorities. That agricultural land supporting your offerings could feed living Egyptians instead. Those workers maintaining your temple could build infrastructure for current needs. The entire apparatus is essentially a tax on the future, requiring later generations to support your afterlife rather than focusing on their own concerns. It's selfish in a profound way, though calling it that would be heresy because pharaohs are supposed to deserve eternal support as divine beings. Still, you can't entirely escape the awareness that you're binding future Egyptians to serve your corpse instead of living for themselves. The meeting concludes with you approving the budget, authorizing additional land grants, and signing contracts for hereditary priestly service. You're doing everything a pharaoh is supposed to do to ensure his eternal sustenance, and yet you're walking away with a growing conviction that this entire system is elaborate theatre, impressively constructed, theologically sophisticated, economically complex theatre that will function for a while before gradually falling apart. Your KA will be well fed initially, then increasingly hungry, then eventually starving for eternity while the living world forgets you ever existed. Some pharaohs dealt with this reality by building bigger mortuary temples, establishing larger endowments, writing more elaborate curses and contracts trying to compel future generations to maintain offerings. Ramesses II created a mortuary cult so massive and well-funded that it actually did continue operating for centuries, though even his eventually declined. But most pharaohs' cults collapsed within decades, leaving their cars to whatever fate awaits unattended spirits. You're probably headed for the latter outcome, but you can't admit that publicly, so you approve the budgets and perform the planning and pretend that eternity actually means eternity. Being pharaoh means building an elaborate economic system designed to feed your spirit forever. Knowing that forever probably means a few decades, and accepting that your eternal destiny depends on social contracts that won't survive the political and economic changes that inevitably come. It's death denial as economic planning, mortality anxiety as temple construction, and the slow realization that when you're gone, You'll eventually be forgotten no matter how many stones you pile up or how many fields you dedicate to feeding your ghost. The grim realities of posthumous economics are still weighing on your mind when your vizier enters with news that immediately shifts your anxiety in a different direction. Your nephew has just arrived at the palace, requesting an audience, and he's brought his young son with him. The child is 9 years old, the same age you were when you became Pharaoh after your father's sudden death. That detail isn't lost on anyone, least of all you, because child pharaohs represent one of the most dangerous political situations in Egyptian history. You became one yourself, which means you remember exactly how vulnerable, manipulated, and essentially powerless you were during those early years when advisors ruled in your name while you performed the role of divine puppet. And now your nephew is parading his own 9-year-old son through the palace, and every courtier present understands the implicit message succession options exist outside the current designated heir. Child pharaohs happen throughout Egyptian history, usually because adult pharaohs died unexpectedly, assassination, illness, accident before their chosen heirs reached maturity. When this occurred, the entire power structure shifted dramatically. The child became pharaoh in name, wearing the crowns and performing ceremonies, but actual governance fell to regents, usually the vizier or the child's mother or powerful priests. These regents wielded enormous power while the child pharaoh grew up, and the transition back to actual pharaonic authority when the child matured was always fraught with danger. Some child pharaohs never successfully seized real control, remaining puppets their entire reigns. Others had to fight civil wars against the very advisors who supposedly served them. You remember your own childhood reign with uncomfortable clarity. You were 9 years old, suddenly thrust into performing divinity, while having no actual understanding of governance or power. Your vizier at the time, a different vizier than your current one, long dead now, essentially ran Egypt for the first decade of your reign. He made the decisions, crafted the policies, conducted diplomacy, and managed the bureaucracy, while you stood on the throne looking divine and repeating words that priests fed you. Every decree issued in your name was actually written by advisors. Every judgment you pronounced was actually decided by officials. You were a figurehead, a divine mascot, a child playing dress-up in regalia too heavy for your young body to comfortably bear. Mainstream historical records document numerous child pharaohs, and the pattern repeats across dynasties, a period of regency during which actual power concentrates in advisors' hands, followed either by the pharaoh successfully claiming real authority upon reaching maturity, or by the regent essentially continuing to rule until death or removal. Tutankhamun became pharaoh at about 9 years old and died at 18 or 19, possibly never exercising genuine independent power during his entire short reign. Historians still argue whether his death was natural, accidental, or the result of court intrigue by people who benefited from a weak, controllable pharaoh. Your nephew's son stands beside his father, dressed in expensive linen, wearing jewellery appropriate to his royal status as a potential heir. The boy looks nervous but composed, clearly coached on proper behaviour. He performs the ritual greetings flawlessly, too flawlessly for a 9-year-old, which tells you he's been extensively trained for exactly this moment. Your nephew is making a statement: this child could rule Egypt if necessary. This child has the bloodline, the training, and the backing. This child represents an alternative to your current succession plan, and that alternative might become relevant if, say, you failed your upcoming Sed festival, or if that Nile crisis worsened, or if any of a dozen potential disasters undermined your authority. Here's what makes child pharaohs particularly dangerous from a current pharaoh's perspective: they're controllable. A mature heir brings his own ideas, his own power base, his own agenda. But a child heir is malleable, easily influenced, a blank slate that powerful factions can shape to their preferences. If your nephew's faction wanted to seize power, putting this 9-year-old boy on the throne would be far preferable to dealing with your adult, designated heir who has decades of political experience and established alliances. The child becomes a tool, a legitimizing puppet that allows the real power holders to govern while maintaining the fiction of pharaonic authority. You're conducting the audience with careful diplomatic courtesy, asking the boy about his studies, complimenting his deportment, treating this as a normal family visit. But everyone in the room understands the subtext. Your nephew is positioning his son as a viable alternative heir, building relationships with courtiers, demonstrating the child's capabilities, and essentially running a quiet campaign for succession without ever explicitly challenging your authority. It's sophisticated political maneuvering, and you can't directly confront it without appearing paranoid or tyrannical. So you smile and nod and pretend this is simply a beloved nephew introducing his son to the royal court. Historians love to examine the murky succession politics that surrounded child pharaohs because the official records are often deliberately vague or contradictory. When a child suddenly became pharaoh, the circumstances of the previous pharaoh's death sometimes got explained in suspiciously convenient ways. Sudden illness could mean assassination. Tragic accident could mean murder staged to look accidental. The child pharaoh's regents had every incentive to cover up anything that might cast doubt on the succession's legitimacy. So the historical record gets sanitized, leaving modern scholars to read between the lines and make educated guesses about what actually happened. You're dealing with this reality right now, in real time. If something happens to you before your designated heir is ready, and he's ready now, but what if something happened 5 years ago? Or 10, this 9-year-old boy could become pharaoh. Your nephew and his allies would become his regents, effectively controlling Egypt while the child wore your crowns and lived in your palace and performed the ceremonies you've been performing for decades. Your entire life's work governing Egypt would be handed over to a child who'd be manipulated by adults pursuing their own agendas. It's a nightmare scenario, and your nephew is casually presenting it as a charming family visit. The boy is actually quite impressive. You have to admit, he answers your questions intelligently, demonstrates knowledge of religious texts and royal protocols, carries himself with appropriate dignity. He's been extremely well prepared for this role, which means your nephew has been planning this presentation for years. This isn't a spontaneous visit. It's the culmination of a long-term strategy to position an alternative heir and demonstrate his viability. The preparation itself is evidence of your nephew's ambition and capability, which makes him more dangerous because competent opponents are always more threatening than incompetent ones. Here's a quirky detail from palace educational records. Royal children who might potentially inherit the throne received specialized training from very young ages. They learned hieroglyphic writing, religious texts, ceremonial protocols, basic administration, and military skills. But they also learned political performance, how to carry themselves, how to speak authoritatively, how to project divine dignity even as children. The education was designed to create function in pharaohs from raw material that was often quite young. This boy has clearly received that education, which means he's being groomed for succession whether you approve or not. The audience concludes, and your nephew departs with appropriate expressions of loyalty and devotion. The words say one thing, the performance says another. He served notice that alternatives exist, that your grip on power isn't absolute, that the succession could be contested or redirected if circumstances change, and you can't do much about it without triggering the very succession crisis you're trying to avoid. Arresting your nephew on vague suspicions would alienate his supporters and potentially spark a civil war. Ignoring the threat allows it to grow. There's no perfect response, just uncomfortable compromises and constant vigilance. You think about your own childhood again, about being that 9-year-old boy performing rituals he barely understood, repeating words that priests wrote for him, sitting on a throne that dwarfed his small body. You remember feeling powerless despite supposedly being the most powerful person in Egypt. You remember gradually realizing, over years, that the adults around you were making all real decisions while you provided divine legitimacy to their choices. You remember the slow, difficult process of claiming actual authority as you matured, pushing back against advisors who'd grown accustomed to ruling through you, establishing yourself as a real pharaoh rather than just a ceremonial one. That boy could be living that experience within a few years if your enemies get their way. Or worse, if you die at the wrong time and there's genuinely no adult heir ready to take power. Child pharaohs weren't usually the result of elaborate conspiracies. They were often just the consequence of bad timing, sudden deaths, and the biological reality that pharaohs were human beings who could die before their succession plans matured. But the effect was the same regardless of intent a child on the throne. Adults controlling power, and Egypt governed by regency rather than genuine pharaonic authority. Being pharaoh means watching 9-year-old relatives being groomed as potential replacements, remembering your own childhood powerlessness, and understanding that your death at the wrong moment could hand Egypt over to a child puppet controlled by ambitious adults. It's succession planning as hostage situation, where the hostage is the entire kingdom and the ransom is your continued survival and political viability. And somewhere in the palace, that 9-year-old boy is probably being told how special he is, how he might be pharaoh someday, completely unaware of how being a child pharaoh actually feels powerful in name, powerless in reality, divine in title, manipulated in practice. Your nephew's calculated visit is still fresh in your mind when another dimension of pharaonic misery arrives in the form of a diplomatic caravan from the Hittite kingdom. They've brought with them a princess barely 16 years old, speaking no Egyptian, looking terrified, who's been presented as your newest wife. This is the foreign bride trap. One of the more insidious aspects of being pharaoh that nobody warns you about until you're already caught in it. Marriage isn't about companionship or even producing heirs when it comes to foreign princesses. It's pure diplomacy, living treaty enforcement, and you're expected to marry women you've never met, can't communicate with, and who represent kingdoms that might be allies today but could be enemies tomorrow. This particular princess is supposed to cement a peace agreement with the Hittites, which sounds diplomatic until you realize you're now married to a potential spy, hostage, or saboteur depending on how political circumstances evolve. The Hittite princess stands in your reception hall, surrounded by her retinue of foreign servants and advisors who accompanied her on the months-long journey from Anatolia. She's wearing Hittite clothing and hairstyles that look completely alien in an Egyptian context. Her jewellery is different. Her cosmetics are different. Even the way she carries herself reflects a different court culture with different protocols. She's been coached on basic Egyptian etiquette. She performs the prostration adequately, though not with the fluid grace of someone raised in Egyptian traditions, but it's immediately obvious that integrating her into your household is going to be a prolonged nightmare of cultural translation, linguistic barriers, and potential security risks. Mainstream historical records document numerous foreign royal marriages, particularly during periods when Egypt needed to secure alliances with powerful neighbouring kingdoms. Amenhotep III married several Mitanni princesses. Ramesses II married Hittite princesses as part of the famous Egyptian-Hittite peace treaty. These marriages were celebrated in official inscriptions as demonstrations of Egypt's international prestige and diplomatic sophistication. What those inscriptions don't mention is how awkward, uncomfortable, and politically dangerous these arrangements actually were for everyone involved, especially the foreign brides who essentially became hostages in a foreign land, married to men they'd never met, expected to navigate a culture they didn't understand. Your translator approaches to facilitate basic communication, and you attempt a welcoming speech that gets rendered into Hittite through this linguistic intermediary. The princess responds with what sounds like a prepared statement about honour and duty and building bridges between great nations. Her voice is steady, but her hands are shaking slightly, and you realize she's absolutely terrified. She's been sent thousands of miles from home to marry a foreign king who's probably old enough to be her grandfather, in a country where she doesn't speak the language or understand the customs, and her entire future depends on successfully navigating a situation she's completely unprepared for. You feel a genuine pang of sympathy, followed immediately by awareness that sympathy doesn't solve the practical problems this marriage creates. The linguistic barrier alone is going to be a massive ongoing issue. You can't have normal conversations with this woman. Every interaction requires a translator, which means nothing is ever truly private. Every discussion happens with witnesses. Every comment gets filtered through someone else's interpretation, and the potential for misunderstanding or deliberate mistranslation is enormous. Historians still argue about whether some diplomatic incidents resulted from translation errors during these foreign royal marriages, or if mistranslations were sometimes deliberately created to serve various political agendas. Either way, you're now married to someone you can't directly communicate with, which makes any genuine relationship essentially impossible. Then there's the cultural clash dimension. Egyptian palace protocols are elaborate, specific, and rooted in thousands of years of tradition. This Hittite princess has been raised in completely different traditions, different religious practices, different social hierarchies, different expectations about royal behaviour. She'll need to learn Egyptian customs while maintaining enough of her Hittite identity to serve as a legitimate diplomatic link to her home kingdom. It's an impossible balance. Become too Egyptian and she loses credibility with Hittite observers who report back to their king. Remain too Hittite and she never integrates into Egyptian court life, becoming a permanent outsider in her own household. Here's a quirky detail from palace administrative records. Foreign royal wives often maintained separate household compounds within the palace complex, staffed primarily by servants from their home countries. This created little cultural enclaves, a Mitanni section, a Hittite section, a Babylonian section, each operating according to different customs and speaking different languages. It was supposed to help the foreign wives feel more comfortable, but it also meant they remained isolated from Egyptian court life, never fully integrated, perpetually foreign. You're about to assign this Hittite princess to exactly such an arrangement, which will make her comfortable but also ensure she remains an outsider. The security implications are genuinely concerning. This princess and her retinue represent direct links to the Hittite kingdom. They'll send regular correspondence back home, reporting on conditions in Egypt, Egyptian military capabilities, palace politics, anything that might be useful intelligence. You can't stop this communication without violating diplomatic protocols and potentially damaging relations with the Hittites. But allowing it means accepting that your palace now contains an organized information network feeding data to a foreign power that's currently allied but could become hostile at any moment. Some pharaohs dealt with this by having scribes secretly copy all foreign correspondence, creating their own intelligence operations to monitor what information was leaving Egypt. Others just accepted the security risk as the price of diplomatic marriages. Then there's the succession nightmare these marriages create. If this Hittite princess bears you a son, which is theoretically one of the marriage's purposes, creating a half-Hittite, half-Egyptian heir who embodies the alliance, what happens to that child in the succession order? Your Egyptian wives and their sons certainly won't appreciate a foreign-born prince competing for the throne. The Hittites, meanwhile, will expect their princess's children to be treated with appropriate honour, and any perceived slight could become a diplomatic incident. You remember the earlier section about harem conspiracies, and you realise you've just added an international dimension to that powder keg. Now, it's not just Egyptian mothers competing for their son's succession, it's Egyptian versus foreign factions, with entire kingdoms potentially backing different candidates. Historians love examining the few surviving letters from foreign royal wives because they provide rare personal perspectives on these arrangements. One Mitanni princess wrote to the Egyptian pharaoh she'd married, complaining that she'd been essentially forgotten, relegated to an obscure corner of the palace with inadequate resources and no attention from her husband. Another Babylonian princess's correspondence suggests she maintained more independence and influence, successfully navigating Egyptian court politics and maintaining her homeland's interests. The outcomes vary dramatically based on individual personalities, political circumstances, and probably large amounts of luck. This Hittite princess could become a successful diplomatic bridge, or a miserable exile or a security threat, or all three simultaneously. The ceremony concludes with you officially accepting the princess as your wife, which involves ritual exchanges and formal proclamations that get translated back and forth. The Hittite ambassadors look satisfied they've successfully completed their diplomatic mission, delivering the princess and cementing the alliance. The princess herself looks overwhelmed, trying to maintain composure while her entire life changes irrevocably. Your existing wives are undoubtedly hearing about this new arrival and calculating how it affects their positions. Your advisors are already thinking about how to manage the security and diplomatic implications, and you're standing there thinking about how this young woman is now permanently your responsibility, another person whose welfare and loyalty you need to manage, another potential vulnerability in the complex web of alliances and enmities that define your reign. You can't even send her back if the marriage doesn't work out. That would be a massive diplomatic insult that could destroy the alliance and potentially trigger war. So you're stuck with this arrangement regardless of how it develops. If she's unhappy, you can't do much about it except ensure she's treated with appropriate honour and hope she doesn't cause diplomatic incidents. If she becomes a security problem, you can't eliminate her without creating an international crisis. If she bears children who complicate succession, you'll need to manage that carefully to avoid both domestic and foreign political disasters. The marriage has trapped you both in a diplomatic arrangement that's supposed to serve political purposes, but requires navigating intensely personal human dynamics with massive political stakes attached. Being pharaoh means marrying strangers from foreign cultures, managing relationships across linguistic and cultural barriers that make genuine connection nearly impossible, and accepting that your marriages serve diplomatic purposes rather than personal fulfillment. It's matrimony as treaty enforcement, intimacy as political theatre, and the constant awareness that this terrified teenage girl from Anatolia is now permanently your problem, your responsibility, and potentially your vulnerability for the rest of your reign. You welcome her to Egypt, assign her quarters, ensure her comfort, and silently add managing foreign wife to the endless list of impossible duties that define your divine existence. The years have accumulated now, each one adding weight to the already crushing burden of being pharaoh. Your said festival finally arrived, and you somehow survived it, barely completing the ritual run, while your joints screamed and your vision blurred. But you finished it, which bought you more time. The Nile eventually returned to normal flood levels, though not before serious economic damage and political erosion you're still recovering from. Your tomb continues its slow construction, that monument to your eventual corpse growing deeper and more elaborate with each passing season. The foreign Hittite princess has learned some Egyptian and settled into her isolated corner of the palace. Your nephew's son is now a teenager, still being groomed as an alternative heir. The harem conspiracies simmer perpetually, never quite boiling over, but never entirely cooling either. And you're tired, so profoundly tired, in ways that have nothing to do with physical exhaustion and everything to do with the accumulated weight of performing divinity for decades. You're standing on the palace balcony at sunset, watching the Nile reflect the dying light, and you're thinking about the fundamental absurdity of your position. You're supposed to be a living god, but your body aches constantly from the physical demands of royal regalia. You're supposed to maintain cosmic order, but natural disasters happen regardless of your piety. You're supposed to be the most powerful person in Egypt, but you're trapped in ceremonies and protocols that control your every movement. You've spent decades performing this role, and the performance has consumed everything that might have been authentically you beneath the crown. Do you even remember who you were before becoming Pharaoh? Or has the role completely replaced the person, leaving only a divine puppet going through motions that were ancient when your ancestors' ancestors sat on this throne? The historical record will remember you or not remember you, which is statistically more likely based on monuments and military victories and building projects. Your name will be carved in stone, assuming it doesn't get deliberately erased by a rival or successor who wants to claim credit for your achievements. Your mummy will rest in that elaborate tomb, assuming grave robbers don't violate it within a few decades of your burial. Your mortuary cult will function, assuming the economic and political systems you've established actually survive beyond a generation or two. Everything you've built, everything you've sacrificed, everything you've endured, rests on assumptions that history repeatedly proves incorrect. Most pharaohs are forgotten. Most tombs are robbed. Most mortuary cults collapse. Most reigns become footnotes, if they're remembered at all. Historians still argue about what being pharaoh actually meant psychologically to the people who held the position. Were they true believers who accepted their divinity completely? Were they cynical performers who knew it was theatre, but played the role anyway? Were they somewhere in between, caught between religious indoctrination and unavoidable awareness of their own mortality and limitations? The evidence is genuinely mixed, because pharaohs couldn't leave honest personal testimony without undermining their own authority. Every text had to maintain the divine performance, even private documents that might have revealed genuine feelings. So you're trapped in a role that prevents authentic self-expression, and future historians will study you without ever really knowing what you actually thought or felt or believed about any of it. Your designated heir visited yesterday, and you saw yourself in him the way he's already calculating, already preparing, already tired before he's even fully assumed the burden. He'll wear these same crowns, perform these same rituals, navigate these same impossible contradictions. He'll be blamed for droughts he can't control, threatened by relatives he should be able to trust, slowly poisoned by cosmetics he's required to wear, and eventually mummified according to procedures that will violate his body while supposedly preserving it for eternity. And his children will do the same, and their children. The cycle continuing until Egypt itself falls or transforms into something unrecognizable. The institution perpetuates itself, consuming pharaohs like fuel, burning through lives to maintain continuity. You think about the ordinary Egyptians you've occasionally glimpsed, farmers working fields, artisans in workshops, merchants in markets, and you wonder if they're actually happier than you despite having no power, no divine status, no monuments being built in their names. They can sleep when they're tired without consulting astronomical charts. They can eat without ceremonies. They can love their spouses without calculating political implications. They'll die and be buried simply, without elaborate tombs or mortuary cults. And maybe that's actually better because they won't experience the cosmic anxiety of wondering if their K will starve for eternity when the offerings stop. Their lives are harder in material terms but simpler in existential ones. And right now that simplicity seems intensely appealing. The sun continues setting, painting the sky in shades of amber and crimson that would probably inspire poets if you had any energy left for poetry. But you're too exhausted for artistic contemplation. You're just watching light fade, thinking about how you've spent decades in this golden cage, and wondering what it was all for. The monuments will crumble, the memories will fade, the careful succession plans will be disrupted by events you can't predict. Everything feels temporary despite being framed as eternal, and the contradiction is starting to feel less like philosophical interesting and more like a cosmic joke at your expense. Your chief priest approaches. There's always someone approaching, always another obligation, another ceremony, another demand on your divine attention, and informs you that tomorrow's schedule includes 5 separate temple visits, a judgment session, a military review, and consultations about next year's building projects. The machinery of pharaonic performance continues regardless of your exhaustion or doubts. The institution doesn't care about your feelings because gods aren't supposed to have feelings, at least not the messy, complicated, authentic feelings that actual humans experience. You're supposed to be serene, confident, eternally divine. So you'll put on the crown again tomorrow, and you'll perform the rituals, and you'll maintain the fiction for another day, being Pharaoh. You finally realized after all these years means sacrificing everything human about yourself to maintain a divine performance that ultimately serves the institution rather than the individual. It's a terrible trade, and you made it before you are old enough to understand what you were giving up. Some pharaohs before you probably reached this same realization and just endured it, lacking any alternative. Others maybe genuinely believed and found comfort in that belief. A few possibly went mad from the contradictions, though that would have been carefully hidden from historical record. You're enduring it, day by day, ceremony by ceremony, until eventually your body gives out and the next pharaoh steps into this elaborate trap. The sky darkens fully now, stars emerging in patterns that priests have mapped and interpreted and assigned religious significance to. You're supposed to see divine order in those stars, cosmic patterns that reflect and affirm Ma'at. But tonight you just see distant lights, indifferent to human concerns. Certainly indifferent to whether one exhausted pharaoh in Egypt continues performing his role or finally admits defeat. The universe is vast and uncaring, and somewhere in your elaborate tomb, workers are carving your name in stone, promising eternity to someone who increasingly doubts that eternity means anything at all. You turn away from the balcony, from the darkening sky and the ancient river and the civilization that's built itself on divine kingship for thousands of years. Tomorrow you'll be Pharaoh again, performing divinity with all the skill and dedication you can still muster. But tonight, in this brief moment of relative solitude, you're just a person tired, uncertain, trapped, and hoping that when death finally comes, it brings actual rest rather than the eternal responsibilities that Egyptian theology promises. The crown waits in your chamber, ready to be worn again. The ceremonies wait in tomorrow's schedule, ready to be performed again. The role waits, infinite and consuming, ready to devour another day of your life in service to something that might be transcendent purpose, or might just be civilization's scale denial of mortality's finality. Either way, you'll wear the crown tomorrow. You'll perform the rituals. You'll be Pharaoh, because that's what you are. What you've always been, what you'll be until death, and possibly, terrifyingly, what you'll continue being in some form even after death if the priests are right. The thought should be comforting, but tonight it just feels like an extension of the same exhausting performance, continuing into eternity without reprieve. You close your eyes, seeking sleep that will come in the prescribed hours according to sacred schedule, and dream of being anyone, anywhere, other than a living God slowly drowning in the weight of his own divinity. Underscore 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 underscore. The desert night settles softly over Egypt now, and perhaps over you too, wherever you are in this moment, listening to this story that's really about the exhaustion of impossible expectations, the weight of crowns that never quite fit, The strange loneliness of being elevated above everyone else. The Pharaoh sleeps now, in his prescribed hours, surrounded by guards and servants and the machinery of divine performance. But in sleep, maybe he's just a person again, just someone breathing in darkness, letting the day's burden slip away for a few precious hours. And maybe that's all any of us can really do. Let the crowns we wear, whatever they might be, the roles we perform, the expectations we carry, let them all rest for a while, dissolving into the gentle darkness, into the quiet spaces between breaths. The Nile flows on, as it always has, as it always will, caring nothing for pharaohs or pyramids or the elaborate stories we tell ourselves about permanence. Just water moving toward the sea, patient and eternal and indifferent, which is somehow, strangely, comforting. Your own breathing has found its rhythm now, slow and steady, like that ancient river, flowing toward rest, toward sleep, toward dreams that ask nothing of you, require no performance, demand no divinity, just the simple gift of letting consciousness drift, softer, slower, into welcome darkness, where even pharaohs and even gods, even you, can finally, gently rest. End of script. Sweet dreams.